If you like our stories, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. The smoke still clung to the sky above King's Landing, but the city did not burn. That was the first thing they would remember, long after the war songs faded and the banners were torn down. The dragon had come, the gates had fallen, and the Golden Company had broken beneath the weight of fire and steel, yet the streets remained standing, trembling but alive. People whispered it already, voices low and uncertain, that the Dragon Queen had chosen mercy. Standing at the highest point of the Red Keep, Daenerys Targaryen looked out over the city she had taken, her silver hair stirring in the wind, her expression unreadable as Drogon shifted behind her, a shadow of wings and flame. Beside her stood Jon Snow, his sword still stained, his silence heavier than any crown that could be placed upon his head, and for a long moment neither of them spoke as the world below them began to realize that everything had changed. It had not been won easily. The gates had opened only after blood had soaked the stones, and even now the cries of the wounded carried through the streets like ghosts refusing to leave. Jon's gaze moved across the city, not with triumph but with something quieter, something burdened, as though he could already feel the weight of what came next pressing against his chest. "It's over," he said finally, though the words felt strange even as he spoke them, like something borrowed from a story that had not yet been written. Daenerys turned her head slightly, her eyes finding his, and there was something there. Relief, yes, but also something deeper, something more dangerous, like a fire that had not yet decided what it would become. "No," she replied softly, her voice steady but distant, "it has only begun." The wind carried her words away, but Jon heard them clearly, felt them settle somewhere beneath his ribs, a quiet warning he did not yet understand. Below them, the Unsullied marched in perfect formation, their discipline unbroken even in victory, while the Dothraki rode through the outer streets like a storm finally given direction. Lords and soldiers alike began to gather in the courtyard, drawn by the same unspoken truth: they were waiting to see who would sit the throne. It had always been the question, the one that had driven men to war and women to madness, the one that had shattered kingdoms and built them again from ash. Jon knew what they expected. He could feel it in the way the northern banners stood a little taller behind him, in the way the southern lords watched him with cautious calculation, as though weighing a future they did not yet trust. He had the name. He had the blood. He had the claim. But as he looked at Daenerys, standing there with the city at her feet and the sky bending to her will, he knew something else with a certainty that cut deeper than any blade. This had never been about claims. It had always been about power, and she held it like it had been waiting for her all along. When they descended into the throne room, the air changed. The great hall was scarred from battle, fragments of stone scattered across the floor, the Iron Throne itself looming at the far end like a jagged shadow that refused to bow to time or war. The lords gathered slowly, voices hushed, eyes shifting between them as though searching for an answer neither of them had yet spoken. Daenerys walked forward first, her steps measured, her presence filling the space in a way that made even the most powerful men seem smaller, and when she reached the base of the throne, she paused, her hand hovering just above the cold, twisted metal. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Jon stepped forward, not ahead of her, not behind, but beside her, and that was when the whispers began. "They will never accept it," one voice murmured from the crowd, barely audible but sharp enough to carry. "Two rulers." Another answered, uncertainty laced with fear. Jon felt the tension ripple outward, felt the fragile balance teeter on the edge of something dangerous, and he knew that whatever happened next would define everything that followed. Daenerys turned slightly, her eyes meeting his again, and there was a question there now, unspoken but unmistakable. "Trust me. Or don't. Choose." The silence stretched, long enough for doubt to take root, long enough for the room to begin dividing itself without a single word being spoken. Then Jon did something no one expected. He stepped forward, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him, and said, "You are my queen." The words landed like a hammer, echoing through the hall, cutting through the whispers and silencing the doubt in a single breath. But he did not stop there. He turned to face the gathered lords, his gaze hardening, his presence shifting into something colder, something stronger, and added, "And I stand with her. Not as a rival. Not as a threat. As her king." The reaction was immediate, shock flashing across faces that had expected conflict, not unity, and for a moment the world seemed to tilt, the future reshaping itself in real time. Daenerys studied him, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes, and then, slowly, she placed her hand on the Iron Throne. "Then we rule together," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Fire and ice. Not divided. Not weakened. United. The words settled into the bones of the room, into the stones of the castle, into the very air itself, and though no one spoke it aloud, everyone understood the truth of it. This was not how it was supposed to be. This was something new. Something dangerous. Outside, the city began to cheer, the sound rising like a wave that crashed against the walls of the Red Keep, but inside the throne room, the silence remained, heavy and watchful, as though the world itself was waiting to see if this fragile alliance would hold. Jon felt it then, deep in his chest, that quiet, persistent unease that refused to be ignored, and as he stood beside her, looking out at the kingdom they had just claimed, he realized something he could not yet put into words. They had won the war. But the peace they had created might be far more dangerous. Peace did not arrive with the dawn. It came slowly, suspiciously, like a wounded animal crawling from the wreckage of war, ready to bite the first hand that reached for it. In the days after the fall of King's Landing, the realm did not celebrate so much as hold its breath. The bells that had once rung in surrender were now replaced by the sounds of rebuilding, cart wheels dragging broken stone through narrow streets, hammers striking splintered beams back into place, soldiers patrolling corners where fear still lingered in every shadow. From the windows of the Red Keep, Daenerys watched it all with a calm stillness that had unsettled half the court already, while Jon stood beside her and felt, more than saw, the division growing beneath the surface. The city had not burned, but that mercy had not erased what she was. To the south she was still the foreign queen who came with dragons and an army no lord had chosen. To the north, she was worse. She was the woman their king had bent the knee to, the queen who wore no Stark blood, no northern name, no memory of winter in her bones. And Jon, for all the loyalty his declaration in the throne room had earned him, could feel the disappointment in every message that arrived sealed in wolf-grey wax. They had expected a northern king. Instead, they had been given a king who stood beside a dragon queen and called that unity. The council chamber became the true battlefield. There were no swords drawn there, no dragonfire, no screams of dying men, but the danger was sharper because it smiled while it poisoned. The surviving lords came one by one, some to pledge loyalty, some to test boundaries, all of them measuring the strange shape of this new rule. Lord Celtigar bowed deeply and spoke of stability, while his eyes flicked too often toward the windows, as if expecting wings to blot out the sun at any moment. A Reach Lord praised Daenerys for her restraint and then spent the rest of his audience addressing Jon as though he were the real gatekeeper to power. An older Storm Lord, his voice rough from age and old pride, bent the knee with visible reluctance and said, "The realm can endure many things, Your Grace, but 2 rulers is not one of them." Daenerys had not raised her voice. She had merely rested one pale hand on the table between them and answered, "Then the realm will learn to endure something new." The man said nothing after that, but Jon saw the look in his eyes. Not fear exactly. Not yet. It was calculation, the cold, ancient kind that had shaped the politics of Westeros long before either of them had been born. Men who could not fight dragons would simply wait for the dragon to stand alone. It was in those long council hours that Jon began to see how deeply they would need each other. Alone, Daenerys could command obedience, but not affection. Alone, Jon could inspire loyalty, but not fear. Together, they held the realm in balance, though even that balance felt delicate, as if one wrong word might shatter it. When the lords from the Westerlands argued over taxes and grain routes, Jon knew when to cut through their pride with blunt honesty. When a southern house complained about the presence of northern men in key posts, Daenerys spoke with such quiet authority that the complaint died before it reached its end. It should have been easy to resent how well they fit together in power, how naturally fire and ice found rhythm when the realm demanded it, but resentment was not what Jon felt. It was something more dangerous because it offered comfort. He began to anticipate the slight tilt of her head when she wanted him to speak first. She began to recognize the shift in his expression that meant he was hiding concern for the sake of unity. In public, they were measured, composed, impossible to divide. In private, the strain of the crown wore thinner masks. That evening the wind off Blackwater Bay rattled the shutters in their solar, carrying the smell of salt and soot into the room. A fire burned low in the hearth, though the air was not cold, and the flickering light softened the hard lines of the chamber until it felt less like a seat of power and more like the lonely center of a life neither of them had imagined for themselves. Jon stood over a table littered with maps and letters, reading the latest message from Winterfell for the third time, as though repetition might blunt its edge. Sansa's words were careful, more careful than they had ever been, and that alone made them dangerous. The North will honor you, brother, but they will not forget who they are. They ask what place they have in this new kingdom, and whether their king still belongs to them. He had not heard Daenerys cross the room, but he felt her stop beside him. Bad news travels faster than good, she said, and her voice, though calm, carried a fatigue she never let the court hear. Jon exhaled and set the letter down. In the North, mistrust travels fastest of all. There was no anger in the words, only truth, and for a moment the silence between them was not awkward but weary, shared in the way only exhaustion can be shared between two people carrying the same burden differently. She moved to the window and looked out over the dark city, the red glow of scattered torches reflecting faintly in the glass. "They do not know me," she said after a long pause, and there was something almost unfamiliar in the admission, something closer to hurt than pride. "They see my armies. My dragons. My name. But they do not know me." Jon watched her profile in the firelight and thought that was true of almost everyone. Men saw symbols because symbols were easier than people. They saw conqueror, queen, foreigner, savior, threat. Very few looked long enough to see the woman beneath the titles, the one who had crossed half the world believing she was born to break chains and now sat on a throne built to forge them. "The North does not trust quickly," he said. "Sometimes not even when it should." She turned then, her eyes lifting to his, and the distance in the room seemed to narrow in a way neither of them named. "And you?" she asked quietly. "Do you trust quickly?" Jon should have answered easily. He should have said no, or offered some guarded northern truth, but instead the words caught on something deeper. He thought of the throne room, of the city spared, of the way she had listened when he urged restraint, even when power begged otherwise. "Not quickly," he said at last. "But I do trust what I see." Something shifted in her expression then, subtle but undeniable, as if his answer had touched a place in her she had been protecting too long. The next morning the first real sign of unrest arrived. A delegation from the north entered the hall before the midday meal, mud still clinging to their boots from hard riding, their cloaks heavy with road dust and resentment. At their head stood Lord Glover, broad-shouldered and unbending, his grey beard making him look older than Jon remembered, though perhaps that was only what bitterness did to a man. He bowed, but only just. "Your Grace," he said, and though he faced Jon, his eyes slid almost immediately toward Daenerys. "The North kept faith in the war. We bled for Winterfell. We bled for the living. And now my people ask whether the freedom they were promised has become another southern leash." The words landed hard, not because they were unexpected, but because they were too close to what Jon himself had feared would come. Daenerys did not answer immediately. She let the silence settle first, let every lord in the room feel the danger of what had just been said. Then she rose from the throne with slow, perfect control, and descended the steps without once looking away from Glover. "Freedom," she said, "is not the same thing as division. I did not fight for this realm to watch it tear itself apart the moment it survives." Glover held her gaze longer than wisdom advised. And the North did not kneel to one queen just to lose itself to another. Jon stepped forward before the room could harden into factions. "Enough," he said, and his voice, sharpened by command, cut through the tension before it could ignite. He looked at Glover first. "You speak for your people, and that is your right. But you do not speak for all the North." Then he turned to Daenerys, and though his face remained composed, his tone softened in a way only she would notice. "They need time. That is all." For one long heartbeat it seemed the room itself waited to see whether she would take offense, whether the queen would hear correction where he meant only caution. Then Daenerys inclined her head once, a gesture so slight most would miss its importance. "Then they will have time," she said. But not disobedience. It was not warmth, but it was not war either, and that alone felt like a victory. Later, when the hall had emptied and the last echo of boots had faded into stone, Jon found himself alone with her again beneath the towering shadow of the throne. The room felt larger without the court, colder somehow, the kind of place where every word mattered more because there were so few to hide behind. "You could have had him seized," Jon said. Daenerys looked up at the throne instead of at him. "I know." There was no pride in the answer. Only fact. "Which you did not." This time she did turn toward him, and the firelight from the sconces caught in her eyes like something alive. "Because if I break the North on the first day of peace, I lose you on the second." The honesty of it struck deeper than it should have, leaving Jon silent in a way battle never had. She took a step closer then, not enough to be improper, not enough to be noticed by anyone who might still be lingering near the doors, but enough to make the space between them feel charged. "You asked me for patience," she said. "I am trying to give it." Jon looked at her, truly looked, and saw for the first time how heavy her restraint must feel to a woman who had won every crown in her life by taking what she believed was hers. "And I know what that costs you," he said. For a moment neither of them moved. The kingdom beyond the doors remained divided, watchful, fragile. But in that silence, for one dangerous instant, it felt as though they stood on the same side of something far more intimate than war. Still, even as night settled over the city and peace pretended to hold, the cracks had begun. The North was uneasy. The South was suspicious. The court had already started to whisper of divided loyalties and hidden ambitions. Fire and ice ruled together now, but the realm had not decided whether to fear that union or tear it apart. And somewhere beneath the weight of law, loyalty, and the throne itself, something else had begun to grow between them, something quieter than power and far more difficult to control. The raven arrived before dawn, its wings cutting through the grey light like an omen that refused to wait for the sun. The guards at the rookery said it had come hard from the north, pushing against the wind as if the message it carried could not afford delay, and by the time it reached the Red Keep, the castle had not yet stirred into full life. Jon Snow read the letter alone at first, the chill of morning still clinging to the stone beneath his boots, and with every line his expression hardened, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of something he had always known would come. The North had not broken its word, but it had begun to bend it. A small holdfast near the last river had refused southern tax collectors, had driven them out with arrows and fire, had declared that the North would answer to its own king, not to a throne forged far from its snows. It was not yet war. But it was not peace either. It was something in between, something dangerous, something that could grow if it was not understood quickly. Jon folded the letter slowly, his thoughts already turning, not to punishment, but to people, to faces he knew, to the kind of men who would make such a choice and believe it was the right one. By the time Daenerys Targaryen entered the chamber, the sun had begun to rise, casting long pale light across the floor. She did not ask for the letter. She saw the answer in his face. "The North," she said, not as a question but as a recognition, and Jon nodded once. A holdfast has defied the crown, he said. They've turned away our collectors. Driven them out. He did not add the rest, not yet, but she heard it anyway. She always did. And you believe they will not be the last, she replied, her voice steady, her gaze already sharpening with purpose. Jon stepped closer to the table, setting the letter down between them. They're afraid, he said. They think this is the beginning of losing what they fought for. Daenerys' eyes flicked briefly to the parchment, then back to him. And you think fear excuses rebellion? She asked, and there was no accusation in it, only the edge of a truth she had learned long before she ever crossed the narrow sea. Jon met her gaze without hesitation. I think fear explains it. And if we don't understand it, we'll only make it worse. The council was called before the day fully began, and the mood in the chamber was different from the fragile calm of the days before. Word had already spread, as it always did, faster than any raven could fly, and the lords gathered with the kind of alert stillness that meant they were waiting to see which way the wind would turn. Some spoke of swift action, of sending soldiers north to remind the realm what defiance cost. Others were quieter, watching Jon, measuring him, wondering if the king in the north would stand with his people or his queen. Daenerys did not sit when she entered. She stood at the head of the table, one hand resting lightly against its edge, and when she spoke, the room fell silent without her needing to demand it. A house has refused the authority of this crown, she said. If that defiance is allowed to stand, it will not remain alone. It will spread. It will grow. And before long, we will not have a realm, only pieces of one. Her words were clear, controlled, but beneath them lay something sharper, something forged in cities she had taken and broken and remade. They must be answered. Jon felt every eye shift to him, felt the weight of expectation settle on his shoulders as surely as any crown. He stepped forward, not to oppose her, but to stand beside her, though the difference between those two things already felt thinner than it should. They should be answered, he said, and the agreement eased some of the tension in the room, if only for a moment. Then he continued, but not with fire. Not with fear. Send me north. Let me speak to them. Let them see that they are still heard. There was a murmur at that, quiet but present, the kind of reaction that meant the court had expected conflict and instead found something more complicated. Daenerys turned her head toward him, studying him in that way she had, as if weighing not just his words but the reasons beneath them. And if they refuse to listen? She asked. Jon did not look away. Then we deal with that when it comes. But if we strike first, we prove them right. The silence that followed stretched longer than comfort allowed. Some of the lords shifted, uncertain, while others leaned forward slightly, sensing that this moment mattered more than the others that had come before it. Daenerys' fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against the wood of the table. You would have me appear weak, she said at last, her voice still calm, though something colder had begun to edge into it. Jon shook his head once. No, he replied. I would have you appear just. The word hung between them, heavier than any accusation, heavier than any defense, and for a heartbeat the room seemed to narrow until there was only the two of them standing there, not as rulers before a court, but as something far more uncertain. She held his gaze, searching it, and he knew what she was asking without her needing to say it. Do you trust me? Or do you trust them? I did not cross the world to beg for loyalty, she said quietly, and though her voice did not rise, the force behind it was unmistakable. I earned it. I took it. I built it from nothing. Jon stepped closer, lowering his voice so that it carried only to her, though the room strained to hear anyway. And you did it because they believed in you, he said. Not because they feared you. Something flickered across her expression then, something brief and sharp, like a memory she had not invited but could not ignore. For a moment it seemed as though she might push back harder, might draw a line between them that could not be easily crossed again. Instead, she exhaled slowly, her gaze dropping to the table before lifting again, steadier this time, though no less intense. "You will go," she said. The decision rippled outward, shifting the air in the room, changing the direction of everything that would follow. "You will speak to them. And you will remind them who rules this realm." Jon inclined his head, relief and concern tangling together in a way that refused to separate. "I will," he said. The council broke soon after, the tension dissolving into quieter conversations and careful glances, but the fracture had already formed. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there, a difference in how they saw the world, in what they believed it would take to hold it together. Later, when the hall had emptied and the echoes of voices had faded, Daenerys remained by the table, her hand resting against the same place it had been when she first spoke. Jon approached slowly, aware that whatever had shifted between them had not been undone by the decision. "You gave me what I asked for," he said. She did not look at him immediately. "I gave you a chance," she replied. Do not mistake the two. There was no anger in the words, but there was distance, the kind that had not been there before. Jon nodded once. "I won't." She turned then, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment the weight of the crown fell away just enough for something else to surface. "If they defy you," she said, "if they make you choose." She did not finish the sentence, but she did not need to. Jon understood. He had always understood. "Then I will choose what's right," he answered. The words felt true as he spoke them. They also felt incomplete. As he left the chamber, the light had fully claimed the day, the city beyond the walls beginning to move again, unaware of how close it had come to something far worse than broken streets. Behind him, Daenerys remained where she was, still and silent, her gaze fixed on nothing and everything at once. The first crack had not been loud. It had not shattered anything. But it had changed something, subtle and dangerous, like a fault line shifting deep beneath the surface. They had chosen a path together. But they had not chosen it for the same reasons. And sooner or later, that difference would matter. The North did not greet him with cheers. When Jon Snow crossed back through the gates of Winterfell, the air carried the same cold it always had, but something beneath it had shifted, something quieter and harder to name. The people bowed, but not as deeply. The banners still flew, but not as proudly. It was not defiance, not openly, but it was not the unshaken loyalty he had once known either. Word of King's Landing had reached them in fragments, shaped by rumor and distance, and each version seemed to grow sharper edges the further it traveled. Some said the Dragon Queen had shown mercy. Others said she had simply delayed her fire. Jon spent days walking the halls, speaking to lords and soldiers alike, not as a king demanding obedience, but as a man asking for understanding, and slowly, piece by piece, the tension began to ease, though it never fully disappeared. They trusted him. That had not changed. But now their trust came with questions he could not answer as easily as before. He stood in the great hall that night with the northern lords gathered before him, their faces lit by firelight and doubt, and he realized that this was not a battle he could win with swords or commands. "You followed me south because I asked you to," he said, his voice steady, carrying through the room without force. "You fought for a realm that was not yours, for people who did not know your names. I won't forget that. And neither will she." There were murmurs at that, some skeptical, some uncertain, but none dismissive. Lord Glover stepped forward, the same man who had spoken in the throne room, his expression still guarded but less rigid than before. "We don't know her," he said again, though this time the words sounded less like accusation and more like truth. Jon nodded once. "Then give her the chance to be known," he replied. "Not as a conqueror. As a ruler." It was not a promise. It was not a command. But it was enough to shift something, just slightly, the kind of shift that might hold for now, even if it could not last forever. When he returned to King's Landing, the city felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The journey north had reminded him of what he stood for, of the kind of leader he believed he could be, and as he entered the Red Keep once more, he carried that certainty with him like armor. Daenerys Targaryen met him in the solar without ceremony, as though she had been waiting, though she would never admit it so plainly. Her eyes searched his face the moment he stepped inside, reading the answer before he spoke it. "They will not rebel," he said, closing the distance between them, "not now." There was a pause, brief but real, and then she nodded once, the tension in her shoulders easing in a way so slight it might have been missed by anyone else. "Then you did what I could not," she said. Jon shook his head. "We did," he answered, and something in the way he said it made her look at him differently, not as a rival, not as a tool, but as something closer to equal. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected to find so quickly. The court still whispered, the lords still watched, but the decisions that once threatened to divide them began, instead, to align. When disputes arose, they spoke first in private, not out of secrecy, but out of understanding, testing each other's thoughts before presenting them to the realm as one. It was not always easy. There were moments when their instincts clashed, when Daenerys' certainty met Jon's restraint and neither was willing to yield immediately, but those moments no longer felt like fractures. They felt like balance. Fire pushed forward. Ice held back. Together, they found something in between that neither could have reached alone. The realm began to notice. The tension in the court shifted from suspicion to something more cautious, more uncertain. They did not know what to make of this unity, this partnership that refused to follow the patterns they understood, but they could not deny its strength. It was late one evening when the change between them became something neither could ignore. The council had run long, the arguments over grain shipments and rebuilding costs dragging into the night, until even the most stubborn lords had been forced into silence by exhaustion. When the chamber finally emptied, Daenerys remained behind, her hand resting against the back of a chair, her gaze distant as though she was still weighing decisions long after they had been made. Jon lingered as well, though he told himself it was for the maps, for the letters still scattered across the table, for anything other than the quiet pull that had begun to draw him back whenever she was near. "You were right today," she said without turning, her voice softer than it ever was before the court. Jon frowned slightly. "About what?" She glanced over her shoulder, a faint curve touching her lips, not quite a smile, but something close. "About listening," she said. "It does not come naturally to me." There was no shame in the admission, only honesty, and it disarmed him more than any argument ever had. He stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing until the space felt charged in a way neither of them named. "You listened," he said. "That's what matters." She turned fully then, her eyes lifting to meet his, and for a moment the weight of the throne, the war, the realm itself seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them standing there in the quiet aftermath of everything they had survived. "You make it sound simple," she said. Jon let out a quiet breath, something almost like a laugh, though it carried no humor. "It isn't," he replied. "None of this is." Their gazes held, longer than necessary, longer than either of them should have allowed, and something shifted in that silence, something subtle but undeniable, like a line they had not realized they were approaching until they had already crossed it. The sound of wings outside broke the moment, distant but unmistakable, and Daenerys' attention flickered briefly toward the window before returning to him. "The realm will test us again," she said, her tone returning to something more measured, though the softness had not entirely faded. Jon nodded. "It always does." There was a pause, and then, quieter still, she added, "But we are stronger together than they expected." The words lingered between them, carrying more weight than they should have, and Jon found himself answering before he had fully thought it through. "Stronger than we expected," he said. This time, when their eyes met, neither of them looked away immediately. Outside, King's Landing continued to rebuild, the people moving through their days with cautious hope, unaware of how much of their future rested on the fragile understanding forming within the walls of the Red Keep. Inside, the court watched and whispered, unsure whether this unity would hold or break under the pressure of power and expectation. But for now, for this brief and dangerous moment, fire and ice had found something that resembled harmony, something that felt almost like trust, and perhaps, if they had been different people in a different world, it might have been enough to keep everything from unraveling. But the world they lived in did not allow for easy endings, and the balance they had built, delicate and hard-won, would not remain untouched for long. The weight of the crown did not come from gold or iron, nor from the jagged edges of the throne that loomed behind it like a warning carved in metal. It came from the silence that followed every decision, from the way the court watched without ever truly speaking, from the knowledge that every choice would be remembered not for its intention, but for its consequence. Daenerys Targaryen felt it in the quiet moments more than anywhere else, in the spaces between council meetings and decrees, when the halls of the Red Keep emptied and the echo of power lingered long after the voices had gone. She stood alone more often now, though she had never commanded more people in her life, and the contradiction settled into her like something she could not remove. The city obeyed her. The armies followed her. The lords bent the knee. And still, there were moments when it felt as though none of them truly stood with her at all. Jon saw it before she spoke it. Jon Snow had learned to read silence as well as words, and in the days that followed their growing alignment in rule, he began to notice the subtle changes in her, the way her gaze lingered a moment too long on the doors after the council dismissed, the way her shoulders held tension even when no one challenged her, the way her certainty, once unshakable, now seemed to carry something beneath it that had not been there before. It was not weakness. It was not doubt. It was something more complicated, something that came from standing at the center of everything and realizing that no one else could truly stand there with you. He did not name it at first. He simply stayed. Longer after meetings. Closer during discussions. Present in ways that did not draw attention, but were impossible to ignore once they were noticed. The court had begun to change as well. Where once there had been open calculation, there was now something quieter, more careful. The lords no longer questioned openly, but their loyalty had not deepened. It had only learned to hide itself better. Conversations stopped when Daenerys entered a room. Eyes shifted away too quickly. Words were chosen with too much precision. It was not rebellion. It was not even defiance. It was distance, and Daenerys felt it more sharply with each passing day. She had crossed deserts, survived fire, built an army from nothing, and broken chains in cities that had never known freedom, but none of those victories had prepared her for this, for the quiet isolation of ruling a people who feared her strength even when they needed it. That evening, the rain came without warning, striking the windows of the Red Keep in sudden, relentless waves that blurred the city beyond into something indistinct and distant. The storm kept the court away, the halls quieter than usual, and for once, the silence did not feel like scrutiny. Daenerys stood by the window, watching the rain as though it might offer answers it did not have, her reflection faint against the glass, pale and distant in the flickering light behind her. Jon entered without ceremony, the door closing softly at his back, and for a moment he did not speak, sensing that whatever held her there was not something to be interrupted lightly. "They are afraid of you," he said finally, not as a judgment, but as a truth spoken plainly. She did not turn. "They have always been," she replied, her voice steady, though quieter than it had been in the council chamber. "Fear has never stopped me before." Jon stepped closer, stopping just behind her, his reflection joining hers in the darkened glass. "Fear can hold a kingdom together," he said, "but it won't make it whole." There was a pause, long enough for the sound of the rain to fill the space between them, long enough for the weight of what he had said to settle. When she spoke again, it was different. Not weaker, not uncertain, but unguarded in a way she had not allowed herself to be since she had set foot in Westeros. "They do not love me," she said, and the words, simple as they were, carried more truth than any command she had ever given. Jon did not answer immediately. He knew better than to offer comfort that would not hold. "Love is not given easily here," he said instead. "Not to kings." Not to queens. She turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting his, searching not for reassurance, but for honesty. And you? She asked. Do they love you? Jon hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because he did. Some do, he said. Some don't. But they know me. The distinction hung between them, quiet but sharp, and Daenerys understood it immediately. They knew him. They did not know her. She stepped away from the window then, the stormlight shifting across her features as she moved, and for the first time since he had entered, the distance between them felt deliberate rather than accidental. I have done everything they asked of me, she said, not angrily, but with a kind of weary clarity. I did not burn their city. I listened to their lords. I have given them peace. Jon watched her, the weight of her words settling into him in a way that felt heavier than any battlefield. Peace is not the same as trust, he replied quietly. It takes time. She let out a slow breath, something close to frustration flickering beneath her calm. Time is not something rulers are given, she said. Time is what they are judged for wasting. The storm outside intensified, the sound of it rising like something alive, and in that moment, with the world beyond the walls blurred and distant, the room felt smaller, more contained, as though it held only the two of them and the truth neither of them had yet fully spoken. Jon stepped closer, not out of duty, not out of politics, but because something in her voice had pulled him forward without thought. You are not alone in this, he said, and the words, though simple, carried more weight than anything he had said in the council chamber. She looked at him then, really looked, as if seeing him not as a king, not as an ally, but as something else entirely, something that had been there all along but had only now come into focus. You are the only one who says that, she replied, and there was no doubt in her voice, no uncertainty, only truth. For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm raged beyond the walls, the realm continued its quiet, uncertain rebuilding, and the crown still weighed heavily on both of them, but in that small, fragile space between them, something shifted again, something deeper than politics, deeper than power. It was not love. Not yet. But it was something that could become it, something dangerous because of what it offered, because of what it might cost. Jon felt it, even if he could not name it, and he knew, in a way that unsettled him more than any battle ever had, that whatever this was, it would not remain simple for long. Daenerys turned back toward the window after a moment, the distance between them returning, though not entirely as it had been before. The realm will not wait forever, she said, her voice steady once more, the queen returning even as the woman lingered beneath. Jon nodded, though his gaze remained on her. Then we won't give it a reason to turn against us, he said. She did not answer, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had not yet said, everything they had not yet decided, everything that would shape what came next. Outside, the storm began to pass, the rain easing into something softer, something quieter, but the tension it had carried did not leave with it. It remained, subtle and growing, woven into the space between them, into the choices they would soon be forced to make, into the fragile balance they were trying to hold together. The crown had begun to weigh heavier. And for the first time, it was not just the realm they were trying to carry. It was each other. The court did not fracture loudly. It did not split in open defiance or erupt into chaos that could be seen and answered. It shifted in quieter ways, in the spaces where power was shaped without ever being declared. In the corridors beyond the throne room, in private chambers lit by low firelight, in conversations that ended the moment footsteps approached, something had begun to take root. Daenerys Targaryen felt it first as absence, as the subtle withdrawal of voices that once spoke freely, as the careful politeness that replaced honest counsel. Jon Snow felt it differently, not as distance, but as division, as the sense that the same men who stood united before the throne spoke very differently when they believed they were unheard. It was not rebellion. Not yet. But it was something that would lead there if left to grow. The council meetings grew longer, but not more productive. Where once there had been disagreement followed by resolution, there was now agreement that felt too smooth, too easily given, as though the real arguments had already taken place elsewhere. A lord from the Reach praised the Queen's judgment with a smile that did not reach his eyes, only to meet Jon in the hallway later and speak of caution, of restraint, of the dangers of ruling through fear. A northern advisor, once blunt and unwavering, began choosing his words more carefully when Daenerys was present, only to press Jon afterward with quiet insistence that the North's patience would not last forever. Each conversation pulled in a different direction, each voice offering guidance that felt less like support and more like influence, and Jon began to realize that the unity they had built in the open was being tested in the shadows. Daenerys did not ignore it. She watched, she listened, and she remembered. She had ruled cities before, had seen how quickly loyalty could be reshaped by fear or ambition, and she recognized the pattern forming around her now. But this was not Meereen. This was not a foreign land she could conquer and remake. This was a realm that believed it already understood power, already knew how rulers should behave, and every time she stepped outside that expectation, the whispers grew louder. She heard them even when no one spoke them aloud. That she was too strong, too decisive, too dangerous to be trusted with absolute rule. And beneath all of it, the question that no one dared to voice directly: how long would Jon stand beside her if that danger became too real to ignore? One afternoon, as the court dispersed from yet another strained council session, Daenerys remained seated on the throne longer than usual, her posture still, her gaze fixed forward as the last of the lords filed out. Jon lingered as well, though he told himself it was habit, that he simply needed to review the decisions they had made, but the truth sat heavier than that. He did not like the way the room felt when it emptied now, the silence no longer neutral but filled with the echo of things unsaid. When the doors finally closed, Daenerys rose slowly, descending the steps with measured grace, though there was a tension in her movement that had not been there before. "They speak to you when I am not present," she said, not accusing, not even questioning, but stating a fact she had already confirmed for herself. Jon did not deny it. "They speak to both of us," he replied. "Just not the same way." Her eyes met his, sharp and searching. "And what do they say?" she asked. Jon hesitated, not because he did not know, but because he did. Because the truth would not sit easily between them, and yet hiding it would be worse. "They say the realm needs balance," he said carefully. "That power should not rest too heavily in one place." The words felt thin as soon as they left him, like a softened version of something far more pointed. Daenerys' expression did not change, but something in her gaze hardened, not toward him, but toward the truth beneath his answer. "They mean me," she said. It was not a question. Jon held her gaze. "They mean fear," he replied. "And they don't understand you." She let out a quiet breath, something almost like a bitter laugh, though it held no humor. "No," she said. "They don't." The days that followed only deepened the divide. Decisions that once came easily now required longer discussions, not because Jon and Daenerys disagreed more often, but because the voices around them had grown louder in their absence. When a dispute arose between two southern houses, the council pushed for a ruling that would favor stability, even if it meant overlooking injustice. Jon argued for fairness, for a decision that would hold the realm together without sacrificing what it was meant to stand for. Daenerys listened, weighing both sides, but when she spoke, her judgment was firmer, sharper, less willing to compromise than before. It was not cruelty. It was certainty. And each time she chose that certainty, the whispers found new life. Late one evening, Jon found himself walking the corridors of the Red Keep without direction, his thoughts circling the same questions he could not yet answer. The torches along the walls flickered in the quiet, their light casting shifting shadows that seemed to move just out of sight. As he passed a half-open door, voices drifted through, low but urgent, and though he should have continued on, something in their tone held him in place. "He will not stand against her," one voice murmured, tense with frustration. "Not yet," another replied. "But he will. He has to. The realm will force it if he does not choose it himself." Jon did not need to see who spoke. The meaning was clear enough without faces. He stepped away before they could notice him, the words settling into him like something heavier than steel. It was no longer just about ruling. It was about choice. About sides. About a line that had not yet been drawn, but was already expected. When he found Daenerys later that night, she was not in the throne room or the council chamber, but in the same solar where the storm had once held them in quiet understanding. The windows were open now, the night air cooler, carrying the distant sounds of the city as it continued to rebuild itself piece by piece. She stood at the center of the room, not looking out, not reading, simply still, as though she were holding herself in place against something unseen. "They are turning us against each other," he said as he entered, the words leaving him before he could soften them. She did not seem surprised. "No," she replied, her voice calm, though there was an edge beneath it now. "They are waiting for us to turn on each other." Jon stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing in a way that had once felt natural, but now carried tension neither of them could ignore. "We won't," he said. It was a promise, though he was not entirely sure who he was trying to convince. Daenerys looked at him then, her gaze steady, searching for something beyond the words. "You believe that," she said, and there was no doubt in her voice, only a quiet recognition of the truth. "But belief does not change what they want." Jon held her gaze. "Then we don't give them what they want." For a moment, it seemed enough. For a moment, it felt as though the unity they had built could still hold, that whatever forces worked against them could be resisted if they remained aligned. But the court did not need them to break openly. It only needed them to begin seeing the world differently. And that had already begun. Outside, the city slept uneasily, unaware of the fractures forming within the walls of the Red Keep, unaware of the quiet war being waged not with swords or dragons, but with influence, doubt, and expectation. Inside, the balance between fire and ice grew more fragile with each passing day, stretched thin by forces neither of them could fully control. They still stood together. They still ruled as one. But the space between them, once filled with trust and growing understanding, now carried something else as well. Something quieter. Something sharper. The defiance did not come quietly. It arrived in the throne room itself, where power was meant to be unquestioned, where words carried weight enough to shape kingdoms, and where even silence could be dangerous if it lingered too long. The court had gathered as it always did, lords and advisers forming their careful lines along the stone, their voices low until the moment demanded otherwise, but there was something different in the air that morning, something sharper, something waiting. Daenerys Targaryen sat upon the Iron Throne, her posture still, her expression unreadable, while Jon Snow stood at her side, his presence steady, though his instincts had already begun to tighten, sensing the shift before it revealed itself. When the doors opened, the sound echoed louder than it should have, and every head turned as Lord Varin of the Crownlands strode into the hall without waiting to be announced, his steps measured, deliberate, as though he had already decided how this moment would end. He did not bow. The absence of it struck harder than any shouted insult could have, the breach of custom immediate and unmistakable, and the silence that followed pressed in from all sides, heavy and expectant. Jon felt it ripple through the room, the collective intake of breath, the realization that something had crossed a line that could not be easily undone. Daenerys did not move at first. She watched him, her gaze calm, controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something that had been building over the past days, sharpened by whispers and doubt and the quiet erosion of trust. "You stand before your queen," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber without effort, each word precise, leaving no space for misinterpretation. Varin met her gaze without flinching, his expression set with the kind of resolve that came from believing one's cause justified any risk. "I stand before a ruler," he replied, his tone respectful in form, but not in substance, but not one I have chosen to follow." The reaction was immediate, voices rising in protest, hands tightening at sword hilts, the fragile order of the court threatening to fracture in a heartbeat, but Daenerys lifted a single hand and the room fell silent again, the authority in the gesture more powerful than any command. Jon stepped slightly forward, not to challenge her, but to stand where he could intervene if needed, his gaze fixed on Varin as though searching for something beyond defiance, something that might still be reached. "You know what you're doing," Jon said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the tension. Varin did not look at him. "I do," he answered. "And I know what it will cost." There was no fear in him. That was what made it dangerous. Daenerys rose from the throne slowly, descending the steps with the same measured control she had shown before, but this time there was no uncertainty in her movement, no hesitation. The court watched as she crossed the distance between them, her presence filling the space in a way that made even the boldest men seem smaller. "You defy the crown in its own hall," she said, stopping only a few steps away from him. "You reject the peace that has been given to you." Varin held her gaze, unshaken. "I reject a rule that was forced upon us," he replied. "A throne taken with dragons is not one I will kneel to." The words landed like a spark in dry tinder, and Jon felt the shift in the room, the way the whispers that had once been hidden now seemed to pulse just beneath the surface, waiting for someone else to speak them aloud. "Enough," Jon said, stepping forward, his voice stronger now, carrying the authority he had claimed in the throne room days before. "You've made your point." He turned to Daenerys, his expression steady, though there was urgency beneath it. "Let him leave. Send him back to his lands. This doesn't need to become more than it already is." For a brief moment, it seemed as though the path he offered might hold, that the balance they had fought to maintain could still be preserved. Daenerys looked at him, really looked, and in her eyes there was something complicated, something caught between trust and something darker, something shaped by everything she had endured to stand where she now stood. "If I let this pass," she said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm, "then it will not be one man next time. It will be 10. Then 100. And they will not come alone." Jon shook his head slightly. "Or it will be one less reason for them to fear you," he replied. "One more reason to believe in what we're building." The silence that followed stretched thin, fragile, balanced on a choice that could not be undone once made. Varin said nothing more. He did not plead. He did not retreat. He simply stood, waiting, as though he had already accepted the outcome. The court watched, breath held, knowing that whatever happened next would not remain contained within this room. Daenerys' gaze moved from Jon back to Varin, and something within her seemed to settle, not with doubt, but with decision. "You speak of choice," she said, her voice rising just enough to carry to every corner of the hall. "You stand here because you believe you have won." She paused, just long enough for the weight of her next words to build. "You do not." Jon saw it then, the moment before it happened, the shift in her that could not be reached once it passed, and he stepped forward again, closer this time, his voice urgent, almost pleading despite himself. "Daenerys," he began, but she did not look at him. "Dracarys," she said. The word cut through the hall like a blade. The sound that followed was not loud at first, just the rush of wings beyond the walls, the sudden change in the air as heat pressed inward, and then the fire came, sudden and absolute, consuming Varin where he stood, leaving no time for screams, no space for anything but the raw, undeniable force of it. The court recoiled, some in shock, some in fear, all of them changed in that instant. The illusion of fragile peace burned away in a single breath. Jon did not move. He stood where he was, the heat of the flames reflecting in his eyes, the reality of what had just happened settling into him with a weight that felt heavier than anything he had carried before. When the fire faded, there was nothing left but ash. Daenerys remained where she stood, her expression unchanged, her posture as steady as it had been when she first descended from the throne, but the room around her had shifted irrevocably. The lords who had once whispered now stood in silence, their fear no longer hidden, their loyalty no longer uncertain. It had been decided for them. Jon turned to her slowly, his gaze searching her face, looking for something, anything, that might bridge the distance that had opened in a single moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low, controlled, though the tension beneath it was impossible to hide. She met his gaze, and for a heartbeat, something flickered there, something almost like regret, but it passed too quickly to hold. "I did," she replied. "Because if I didn't, they would never stop testing us." The word "us" hung between them, but it no longer meant what it had before. Jon said nothing after that. There were no words that could undo what had been done, no argument that could reach her now that the line had been crossed. Around them, the court began to move again, slowly at first, then with growing purpose, each lord carrying away a version of what they had witnessed, each version shaping the story that would spread beyond these walls. Fear would follow it. Loyalty would follow it. But so would doubt. And for the first time since they had taken the throne together, Jon felt it clearly, not as a quiet unease, but as something undeniable. They were no longer standing on the same ground. The throne room did not forget. The ash had been cleared, the stone scrubbed clean, the air aired out until no trace of smoke remained, but something lingered all the same, something that could not be washed away or replaced with order. The lords returned, as they always did, their banners raised, their voices measured, but the space between them had changed. Where there had once been cautious calculation, there was now certainty. Not of loyalty, but of consequence. They had seen what defiance brought. They had seen what power looked like when it chose not to hesitate. And so they bent the knee more easily now, spoke more carefully, agreed more quickly. It should have been easier to rule them. It should have brought stability. Instead, it brought silence, and that silence carried a weight neither Jon Snow nor Daenerys Targaryen could ignore, though they felt it in very different ways. Jon found himself standing further from the throne than he had before, not by design, not by decision, but by instinct. It was subtle at first, the way he positioned himself during councils, the way he spoke less quickly when Daenerys gave judgment, the way his presence, once naturally aligned with hers, now carried a hesitation that had not existed before. He did not challenge her openly. He did not withdraw entirely. But something in him had shifted, something that had once trusted without question now measuring each moment more carefully, weighing each decision against something deeper than loyalty. The execution had not been a surprise. He understood why she had done it. That was what made it worse. Because understanding did not make it right. And knowing that she believed it was necessary left him standing in a place he did not know how to hold. Daenerys saw it. She saw it in the spaces where he did not speak, in the seconds where his gaze lingered on her a moment too long before turning away, in the quiet absence of the instinctive support that had once come without effort. She said nothing at first. She allowed the days to pass, the court to settle into its new rhythm, the fear to take root where doubt had once been. The realm obeyed more cleanly now. Orders were carried out without resistance. Messages returned with swift agreement. The whispers had not disappeared, but they had changed tone, lower, more cautious, less bold. It was what power was meant to do. It was what she had always known it must do. And yet, as the obedience around her strengthened, something else weakened, something far more difficult to command. The council meeting that followed the execution should have been simple. A dispute between two houses in the Stormlands, a matter of land and loyalty, nothing that required more than firm judgment and clear direction. The lords presented their arguments, voices steady, eyes carefully avoiding any hint of challenge, and when Daenerys spoke, her ruling was decisive, unquestioned, final. There was no hesitation in her voice, no room left for interpretation. It was clean, efficient, effective. The kind of ruling that ensured stability. When she finished, the lords bowed, their acceptance immediate, their departure swift. No arguments followed. No resistance lingered. It was everything a queen could ask for. And still, as the chamber emptied, the silence that remained felt heavier than any disagreement had before. Jon lingered again, though this time the distance between them felt more pronounced, more deliberate, even if neither of them had chosen it outright. "They didn't argue," he said, his voice quiet, almost thoughtful, though there was something beneath it that did not settle easily. Daenerys turned from the table slowly, her gaze finding him with a calm that had become sharper in recent days. "Because they understand now," she replied. Jon nodded once, but the motion lacked conviction. "Or because they're afraid," he said. The words were not accusatory. They were simply there, unavoidable. Daenerys held his gaze, unflinching. "Fear keeps the peace," she said. Jon's expression tightened slightly, something in him resisting the simplicity of it. "It keeps silence," he answered. "Not peace." The space between them stretched, thin and fragile, balanced on words that neither of them had meant to turn into conflict, and yet had. Daenerys took a step closer, her presence filling the room in a way that had once felt like alignment, but now pressed against him with something sharper. "You think I was wrong," she said, not as a question, but as a truth she had already seen in him. Jon did not look away. He had never been able to lie well, not to her, not to anyone. "I think it changes things," he replied. It was not the answer she wanted. It was not the answer he could avoid. Her gaze hardened, not with anger, but with something colder, something more controlled. "Everything changes things," she said. "That is what ruling is." Jon let out a slow breath, the weight of the conversation settling into him. "Not like that," he said quietly. For a moment, it seemed as though she might push further, might force the argument into something sharper, something that would break rather than bend, but instead she stepped back, the distance returning, though it did not feel the same as before. "You asked me to show restraint," she said, her voice steady once more. "I have. But I will not let this realm fall apart because you fear what strength looks like." Jon felt the words more than he heard them, the shift in them, the way they placed him on one side of something he had not meant to stand against. "And I won't let it hold together by fear alone," he replied. The words hung between them, heavier now, no longer a quiet difference, but something closer to division. That night, the Red Keep felt larger than it had in days, the corridors stretching longer, the spaces between rooms carrying a stillness that felt almost deliberate. Jon walked them without purpose, his thoughts circling the same questions he could not yet answer, the same realization pressing harder with each step. He had chosen to stand beside her. He had believed in what they were building. He still did, in some part of him that refused to let go. But belief was no longer simple. It had become something he had to hold onto, something he had to choose each time it was tested. And it was being tested more often now. Daenerys stood alone once more in the throne room, though this time the solitude felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but sharper, clearer, as though something within her had settled into place. She had given them a chance to follow willingly. She had shown restraint where she could. And when that had not been enough, she had done what was required. The realm had responded. Order had strengthened. Stability had taken root. It was what she had always believed power was meant to do. And yet, as she looked out over the hall, her gaze lingering on the place where Jon would usually stand, she felt the absence of something she had not realized she had begun to rely on. Not loyalty. Not agreement. Something else. Something quieter. Something that had made the weight of the crown feel lighter, even if only for a moment. Now, that weight had returned. And this time, it pressed harder. Secrets in King's Landing did not hide. They moved. They shifted from mouth to mouth, from shadow to shadow, changing shape until even truth no longer recognized itself. But some secrets did not need to travel to become dangerous. Some simply waited to be found. Jon Snow had not been looking for one when he entered the smaller council chamber that morning, drawn only by the promise of quiet and a stack of unopened letters that had been set aside after the last meeting. The room was empty, the air still, the kind of silence that made every movement feel louder than it should, and for a moment, it felt like the only place in the Red Keep untouched by the shifting tension that had begun to settle over everything else. He crossed to the table, breaking the seal on the first letter without thought, expecting nothing more than another dispute, another request, another piece of the endless work of ruling. It was not what he found. The parchment was thin, the writing precise, careful in a way that suggested the author had weighed every word before committing it to ink. It was not addressed to him. It was addressed to her. Daenerys Targaryen. Jon should have set it aside. He knew that. But something in the tone of the first line held him there, something that did not belong to ordinary politics or routine counsel. Your Grace, the loyalty of the realm is not what it appears. The southern lords bend the knee, but they do not yield their ambitions. They will not move openly, not yet, but they will move. When they do, it will not be with words. It will be with knives, with poison, with quiet betrayal that leaves no trace until it is too late. Jon felt his grip tighten slightly on the parchment, his eyes moving more quickly now, drawn forward by something he did not yet understand. There was more. Much more. We have identified those who would act against you when the time is right. They gather quietly, hidden behind their oaths, waiting for weakness. If you wish to secure your rule before they strike, the opportunity is now. Names were listed beneath the words, each one a lord who had stood in that very throne room, who had bent the knee, who had spoken carefully measured loyalty. Jon recognized them all. Some had argued against her. Some had supported him. Some had done both, depending on who they believed held the greater influence. His chest tightened as he read the final line. Act swiftly, and the realm will never have the chance to turn against you. Delay, and you risk losing everything you have taken. The letter slipped slightly in his hand as he lowered it, the weight of what he had just read settling into him with a force that felt far heavier than ink and parchment should allow. This was not rumor. This was not speculation. This was planning. And it was not being sent to him. It was being sent to her. Jon's mind moved quickly now, piecing together what he had seen over the past days, the whispers, the silence, the subtle shift in how the court behaved. It fit. Too well. But there was something else, something that did not sit as easily, something that pressed harder against him the longer he held the letter in his hand. She had not told him. The realization came quietly, but it did not soften its impact. If she had received this letter, if she knew what it contained, then she had chosen not to share it. Not with him. Not with the one person who had stood beside her when the court threatened to divide, who had argued for her when others questioned her, who had trusted that whatever they were building was something they were building together. Jon closed his eyes for a brief moment, the tension in him tightening, not into anger, but into something far more difficult to navigate. Doubt. The door behind him opened softly, the sound pulling him back before his thoughts could settle into anything more concrete. He turned instinctively, the letter still in his hand, and found Daenerys standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable, though her eyes had already taken in the scene before her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched, filled with something neither of them had prepared for, something that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. Her gaze moved from his face to the parchment in his hand, and something shifted there, subtle but unmistakable. "You've read it," she said. It was not a question. Jon did not move, did not attempt to hide the letter or pretend he had not seen it. There was no point. "It wasn't meant for me," he replied, his voice steady, though there was something beneath it now that had not been there before. Daenerys stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with quiet finality. "No," she said. "It wasn't." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled heavily in the space between them. Jon watched her, searching for something in her expression, some sign of what this meant, of where it placed them now. "When were you going to tell me?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. She crossed the room slowly, her steps measured, controlled, as though she were choosing each one carefully. When she reached the table, she did not take the letter from him. She simply looked at it, her gaze lingering on the names written there, on the threat it represented, on the decision it demanded. "When I knew what I was going to do," she said at last. The answer did not settle anything. It only deepened the space that had begun to grow between them. "And now?" Jon asked, his voice quieter now, though no less firm. Daenerys lifted her gaze to his, and this time, there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty, only the same clarity she had carried into the throne room when she had spoken the word that could not be taken back. "Now I do." Jon felt the weight of that answer before he fully understood it. "You're going to act on this," he said, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time. Daenerys did not deny it. "If I don't," she replied, "they will." Her voice remained calm, controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something harder, something that had been sharpened by everything she had seen, everything she had learned about this realm that had never truly been hers. "This is not fear, Jon. This is reality." He shook his head slightly, the motion small but deliberate. "It's one letter," he said. "One warning. That doesn't make it truth." Her expression tightened, not with anger, but with something closer to frustration. "It aligns with everything we've seen," she said. "The whispers. The silence. The way they watch us." She stepped closer then, the distance between them narrowing in a way that felt more confrontational than it had before. "You see it too," she added. "You just don't want to name it." Jon did not step back. He held his ground, though the tension between them now felt different, sharper, less balanced than it had been even days before. "And if you're wrong?" he asked. "If you act on this and you're wrong, what does that make you?" The question hung between them, heavy, unavoidable. Daenerys did not answer immediately. For a moment, something flickered across her expression, something that might have been doubt, but it passed too quickly to hold. "It makes me a ruler who survived," she said. The words settled into Jon like something cold. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since they had stood together in the throne room, he felt the distance between them as something real, something that could not be closed simply by standing side by side. "And where does that leave us?" he asked, though he was no longer entirely sure what us meant. Daenerys' gaze held his, steady, unyielding. "On the same side," she said. Jon did not answer. Because for the first time, he was not sure that was still true. The city did not know the moment it began. There was no bell, no signal, no declaration that something irreversible had been set into motion. It started the way all dangerous things did in King's Landing, quietly, beneath the surface, hidden behind purpose and necessity until it could no longer be contained. Jon Snow felt it before he saw it, the shift in the air, the tension that gathered like a storm not yet broken, and by the time the first messenger reached him, breathless and wide-eyed, the outcome had already begun to unfold. "The Queen," the man managed, his voice unsteady, "she's gone to the eastern quarter. The houses listed. They've been seized." Jon did not wait for more. He was already moving, already crossing the halls of the Red Keep with a speed that drew attention without explanation, the weight of the letter still fresh in his mind, the words he had not been able to accept now pressing against him with growing urgency. Outside, the city was not in chaos, not yet, but something had begun to ripple through it, a disturbance that spread not with panic, but with fear that had not yet found its voice. Soldiers moved through the streets in disciplined lines, unsullied securing intersections, Dothraki riders circling the outer edges of the quarter as though containing something that had not yet broken free. The people watched from doorways and windows, their silence heavy, uncertain, waiting. Jon pushed through them without slowing, his eyes fixed ahead, the distant sound of wings cutting through the air confirming what he had already begun to understand. This was not an arrest. This was not a warning. This was something else. He found her at the center of it. Daenerys Targaryen stood in the open square between the seized estates, Drogon looming behind her like a shadow given shape, his presence pressing heat into the air even without flame. The lords named in the letter had been brought out, bound but unbroken, their expressions shifting between defiance and something far closer to fear now that they stood beneath the weight of what she commanded. Around them, the soldiers held the perimeter, the crowd kept at a distance, the entire scene contained in a way that made it feel less like justice and more like a moment waiting to become something else entirely. Jon slowed as he approached, not from hesitation, but from the sudden, undeniable understanding that whatever happened next would not be undone. "Daenerys," he called, his voice cutting through the tension, and for a brief moment, her gaze shifted toward him, the smallest flicker of something passing through her expression before it settled again into the same controlled certainty he had seen in the throne room. "You came," she said, not surprised, not relieved, simply acknowledging a fact she had already accounted for. Jon stepped closer, his eyes moving quickly over the scene, the bound lords, the soldiers, the people watching from the edges, and then back to her. "This doesn't have to happen like this," he said. "Bring them back to the keep. Question them. If there's truth in that letter, we'll find it. But this," he gestured slightly, not at the lords, but at everything around them. "This will only prove what they already fear." Daenerys did not look away from him, but her expression did not change. "They were given their chance," she replied. "They chose to wait. To plan. To act when they believed I would not see it coming." Her voice carried across the square, not raised, but strong enough that those closest could hear, strong enough that the message would not remain contained. "I will not wait for them to decide when to strike." Jon shook his head, frustration rising now, no longer held in the careful balance he had maintained before. "You don't know that they would have," he said. "You have a letter. That's not proof. That's suspicion." The word landed harder than he intended, and he saw the shift in her eyes, the way it sharpened, not with anger, but with something colder. "It is enough," she said. The simplicity of it struck him more deeply than any argument could have. Enough. Enough to act. Enough to burn. Enough to decide the fate of men without certainty, without confirmation, without the balance he had believed they were trying to hold together. Jon stepped closer, lowering his voice, though he knew it would not remain unheard. "If you do this," he said, "if you use fire here, in the city, in front of them," he did not need to finish. She understood. She always did. "Then they will know," she said, her tone unwavering. "They will know what happens when they stand against me. Against me." The words cut through him, sharper than anything else he had said, not because of their meaning, but because of what they left out. Jon did not step back. He did not look away. "We're supposed to rule together," he said, the words quieter now, but no less heavy. Daenerys held his gaze, and for a moment, something in her expression softened, something that might have been hesitation, might have been memory, might have been the echo of everything they had built before this moment. But it did not hold. It did not last. It passed, replaced by the same certainty that had carried her across continents, that had built her power from nothing, that had never once allowed doubt to decide her path. "We do," she said. Then she turned away from him. The movement was small, but it was final. She faced the bound lords, her presence filling the space between them, the air itself seeming to tighten as Drogon shifted behind her, the low rumble in his chest sending a ripple through the crowd that had gathered at the edges of the square. "You were given peace," she said, her voice carrying now, no longer just for Jon, no longer contained. "You were given the chance to stand with this realm as it was rebuilt." The lords said nothing. They stood as they had before, some defiant, some afraid, all of them understanding now that their choices had narrowed to nothing at all. "You chose differently," she continued. Jon moved again, one step forward, his voice cutting through hers, not in defiance, but in desperation that he could no longer contain. Daenerys, stop, Dracarys. This time, the word did not feel like a spark. It felt like a breaking. The fire came faster than thought, faster than any chance to intervene, a wall of heat and light that consumed the space where the lords had stood, leaving nothing but flame and ash in its wake. The crowd recoiled, the silence that followed heavier than anything that had come before, not uncertain now, not questioning, but stunned, rooted in the kind of fear that did not need words to exist. Jon stood where he was, the heat pressing against him, the reality of what had just happened settling into him with a clarity that left no room for denial. This was not the throne room. This was not a single act contained within stone walls. This was the city. And beyond the fire, beyond the ash, beyond the silence that had swallowed everything else, there were others. Servants. Guards. People who had not been named, who had not been part of any plan, who had simply been there. Jon saw them now, caught at the edges of the destruction, their forms still, unmoving, and something in him shifted, not slowly, not carefully, but all at once. He turned to her. She stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as though the fire had been nothing more than a necessary step, a decision made and carried out without hesitation. For a moment, he could not find words, not because they did not exist, but because none of them felt sufficient for what had just happened. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it carried more weight than it ever had before. "There were others," he said. Daenerys' gaze met his. "They should not have been there." The answer did not falter. It did not bend. It did not regret. Jon stared at her, the distance between them no longer subtle, no longer growing slowly, but fully formed, undeniable, impossible to ignore. "That's not justice," he said. Her expression hardened, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous. "It's what's necessary." The words settled into the space between them, final, unyielding, and in that moment, Jon understood something he had been trying not to see. The line had been crossed. And there was no going back. The city did not recover that night. It breathed, it moved, it continued, because it had no choice but to do so, yet something beneath it had changed in a way that no rebuilding could hide. The streets in the eastern quarter were quieter than the rest, the kind of quiet that did not belong to peace, but to memory, to the echo of something that had not yet settled. Jon Snow did not stay to watch it fade. He left the square the moment the flames died, not because he could not bear to look, but because he knew that if he stayed, if he allowed himself to remain in that place even a moment longer, he would not be able to speak when it mattered most. And it needed to be said. Not in front of the court. Not before soldiers and banners and fear. But to her. He found Daenerys Targaryen in the throne room, standing alone beneath the jagged silhouette of the Iron Throne, the last light of evening slipping through the high windows and catching in the metal behind her like dying embers. She did not turn when he entered. She did not need to. She knew it was him. She always did. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had happened, everything that had not yet been said, and Jon realized that this was not like their conversations before, not like the quiet disagreements or careful alignments they had built in the early days. This was something else entirely. Something that would not end in compromise. "You burn them," he said. The words were simple. They did not need to be anything else. Daenerys did not move at first. She stood where she was, her gaze fixed forward, her posture unchanged, as though the throne itself held her in place. "They were planning to betray the crown," she replied, her voice steady, controlled, the same tone she had used in the square, in the council, in every moment where doubt had no place. Jon stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing with each word that followed. "You don't know that," he said. "You had suspicion. You had names. That's not proof." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. The weight of it carried enough on its own. She turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, something flickered there, something that might have been the woman he had stood beside in the early days, the one who had listened, who had hesitated, who had trusted him enough to choose restraint when it mattered. But it did not hold. It passed, replaced by something colder, something sharper, something shaped by everything she had done to reach this place. "I know what I saw," she said. "I know what they were becoming." Jon shook his head slightly, the motion tight, controlled. "You saw what you expected to see," he replied. "That's not the same thing." The air between them tightened. "Do you think I wanted that?" she asked, and for the first time, there was something beneath her control, something that edged closer to emotion, though it did not break through. "Do you think I take pleasure in it?" Jon did not answer immediately. He held her gaze, searching for something he could still hold onto, something that might bridge the distance that had opened between them. "I think you believe it's the only way," he said at last. "And that's what scares me." The words landed harder than anything he had said before. Daenerys took a step toward him, closing the space between them in a way that felt less like connection and more like confrontation. "You think I'm wrong," she said. Not a question. A truth spoken plainly. Jon did not look away. "I think you're changing," he answered. For a moment, the room held its breath. "Of course I am," she said, her voice steady again, though the edge had sharpened. "That is what this requires. That is what ruling demands." She gestured slightly, not at him, not even at the throne, but at everything beyond the walls, at the city, the realm, the weight of it all. "You cannot hold power and remain the same man who refused it. You cannot protect a kingdom by hoping it will not turn on you." Jon stepped closer still, the space between them now almost gone, the tension thick enough to feel. "And you cannot rule it by destroying anyone who might," he said. Their gazes locked. Neither of them moved. For a heartbeat, it felt as though everything else had fallen away, the court, the war, the throne, the realm itself, leaving only the two of them standing in the space they had built together and were now tearing apart. Jon saw it then, clearly, not as doubt, not as fear, but as certainty. She believed in what she had done. She believed in what she was becoming. And no argument, no reason, no appeal to who she had been would change that. "They will follow me now," she said quietly. Jon felt something in him tighten at the words, not because they were untrue, but because of what they meant. "They will fear you," he replied. Daenerys held his gaze, unflinching. "They will not challenge me," she said. The difference between the two hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. "And what about me?" Jon asked. The question was softer than anything else he had said, but it carried more weight than all the rest combined. For the first time, she hesitated. It was brief. Barely there. But it was real. "You stand with me," she said. Jon's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did, something that could not be hidden, something that spoke louder than any words he might have chosen. "I stood with you," he said. "Because I believed in what we were building." He paused, the weight of the next words settling into him before he spoke them. "I don't know what this is anymore." The silence that followed was different from the others. Not tense. Not uncertain. Final. Daenerys looked at him, really looked, as though trying to see past the words, past the distance that had grown between them, back to something that had existed before any of this began. For a moment, something in her expression shifted, something that might have been regret, might have been something else entirely, but it did not hold. It never held. "This is what it takes," she said. Jon did not answer. Because he understood now. He understood that they were no longer arguing about a decision. They were arguing about who they were willing to become. And they were no longer the same. The Red Keep did not sleep easily anymore. Even in the quietest hours of the night, When the torches burned low and the corridors emptied of movement, there was a tension that refused to settle, something that lingered in the stone itself, as though the castle had begun to remember every decision made within its walls. Jon Snow felt it in every step he took, in every silence that followed him, in the way the guards straightened just a little too quickly when he passed, as though they were unsure what version of him they were meant to serve. King? Ally? Or something else entirely? He had not spoken to Daenerys Targaryen since the throne room, not truly, not beyond the necessary words that passed between rulers when the realm demanded it, and the absence of it sat heavier than any argument they had left unfinished. It was not anger that followed him. It was uncertainty. And that was worse. He stood on the outer balcony overlooking the city, the night stretched wide before him, the lights below scattered and uneven where rebuilding still fought against memory. The eastern quarter remained darker than the rest, its silence louder than the noise of the rest of the city combined, and Jon found his gaze returning there without intention, drawn back to the place where something had shifted beyond repair. He had told himself he would understand it. That he would find a way to reconcile what she had done with what he had believed in. But every time he tried, the answer refused to come. The line had been crossed, not just in action, but in belief, and he did not know how to stand beside her anymore without stepping across it himself. "You're avoiding me." Her voice cut through the quiet behind him, calm, measured, but unmistakable. Jon did not turn immediately. He did not need to. He knew she was there. He had known the moment she stepped onto the balcony, the way the air shifted, the way the silence changed shape around her presence. "I've been busy," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. There was a pause, and then the faint sound of her steps as she moved closer, stopping just behind him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence even without looking. "That's not true," she replied. Jon exhaled slowly, the breath carrying more weight than it should have, and finally turned to face her. The distance between them was small, but it felt larger than it had ever been, filled with everything neither of them had been able to say. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. The question was not defensive. It was tired. Daenerys studied him, her gaze steady, searching, as though trying to find something that had been there before and was now slipping out of reach. "I want you to tell me the truth," she said. Jon let out a quiet breath, his gaze dropping for a moment before returning to hers. "I already have," he replied. "You just don't like it." The words settled between them, sharp, unsoftened, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Then say it again," she said. There was no anger in her voice. Only insistence. Jon held her gaze, the weight of everything pressing in on him, every moment that had led them here, every decision that had shifted them further apart, and he knew that whatever he said next would not be something that could be taken back. "I don't believe in what you're doing," he said. The words did not echo. They did not need to. Daenerys did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice. But something in her expression changed, something subtle but unmistakable, as though a door had closed behind her, quietly, completely. "You don't believe in me," she said. Jon shook his head, the motion immediate, though it did nothing to soften what had already been spoken. "That's not what I said," he replied. "I believe in you. I just don't believe this is the only way." He gestured slightly toward the city, toward everything beyond them, toward the weight of the choices she had made. "You're choosing fear over trust. Power over people." Her gaze hardened, not with anger, but with something colder, something that had been growing in her with every challenge, every doubt, every moment she had been forced to prove herself in a realm that had never truly accepted her. "And you're choosing hope over reality," she said. "You think they will follow you because they should. Because it's right. That's not how this works." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them completely now, her voice lowering, though it carried more force than before. "They follow strength, Jon. They follow power. They follow what they cannot challenge. Jon did not step back. He did not yield. And what happens when they stop following? He asked. When fear isn't enough anymore? What happens then? The question hung between them, heavy, unavoidable, and for a moment, Daenerys said nothing, her gaze locked on his, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, her voice quieter now, but no less certain. Then I will remind them why they should. The answer settled into him like something cold and final. Jon looked at her, really looked, searching for something, anything, that might still connect them to what they had been, to what they had tried to build together, but all he found was the same unwavering certainty that had carried her to this point. That's not ruling, he said. That's control. Daenerys' expression did not change. That's survival. The word lingered, heavier than anything else she had said. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city stretched out behind them, the night pressing in around them, and the space between them, though physically gone, had never felt wider. Do you still believe in me? She asked. The question was softer than the others. But it carried more weight. Jon did not answer immediately. He could not. Because the truth, when it came, was not simple. It was not clean. It was not something that could be spoken without breaking something that had already begun to fracture. He looked at her, at the woman who had stood beside him, who had trusted him, who had chosen restraint when he had asked for it, who had built something with him that had felt, for a brief moment, like it might hold. And then he looked at the woman she had become, the one who stood before him now, unyielding, certain, willing to do whatever it took to keep what she had claimed. I don't know, he said. The words were quiet. But they were enough. Daenerys' gaze held his for a moment longer, something flickering there, something that might have been hurt, might have been anger, might have been something else entirely, but it did not surface. It did not break through. It settled instead, deep, controlled, transformed into something sharper, something that did not waver. That's your answer, she said. It was not a question. Jon did not correct her. Because there was nothing left to correct. The silence that followed was not uncertain. It was complete. And in that silence, something between them broke, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that could not be undone, in a way that would shape everything that came after. Morning did not bring clarity. It came grey and heavy, the kind of dawn that carried no warmth, no sense of renewal, only the quiet continuation of something that had already begun to unravel. Jon Snow had not slept. He had remained on the balcony long after the night had settled, long after the torches had burned low, long after the city itself had grown quiet, turning the same words over in his mind until they lost their meaning and then found it again in sharper form. I don't know. He had said it because it was true. But truth, he was beginning to understand, was not always enough. Not here. Not when power demanded certainty and anything less was seen as weakness. The summons came before the day fully broke. A guard found him where he stood, his posture rigid, his voice careful. The Queen has called the council, he said, though there was something in the way he spoke the words that suggested this was not a routine gathering. Jon nodded once, dismissing him without question, though the unease in his chest tightened as he made his way back through the halls of the Red Keep. The castle felt different again, not in its structure, not in its sound, but in its atmosphere, as though something had shifted overnight, something that had settled into place while no one was watching. When he entered the council chamber, he saw it immediately. Daenerys Targaryen stood at the head of the table, not seated, not waiting, but already in command of the room in a way that left no space for uncertainty. The lords had gathered more quickly than usual, their expressions controlled, their eyes sharp, as though they understood that this was not simply another decision to be made, but something more final. The moment Jon stepped inside, the attention shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the room turning to include him in whatever had already begun. "You're late," Daenerys said. Her voice was calm. It always was. Jon crossed the room without answering, taking his place beside the table, though not as close to her as he might have before. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone steady, though the tension beneath it had not faded. Daenerys did not waste time. "The realm is not stable," she said. "Not truly. What we've done has brought order, but it has not brought loyalty. That will take more than patience." Her gaze moved across the lords, holding each one for a moment, measuring, reminding. "We cannot allow doubt to grow into resistance." Jon felt the words settle before he understood where they were leading. "What are you saying?" he asked. She turned to him then. And this time, there was no hesitation in her expression. "We move forward," she said. "We secure what we've built before it can be threatened again. The remaining houses that have shown hesitation, that have held back their full allegiance, will be brought to heel. Publicly. Completely." The meaning was clear. Too clear. Jon's jaw tightened slightly, though he did not interrupt her immediately, allowing the weight of her words to settle into the room, to be felt, to be understood by everyone present. The lords did not speak. They did not object. They did not question. They waited. They always waited. "And how do you plan to do that?" Jon asked, though he already knew the answer. Daenerys' gaze did not waver. "The same way I did before." The room did not react. But the silence changed. Jon felt it, the shift in it, the way it deepened, the way it pressed in around him as though expecting something, as though waiting for him to say what they would not. "You can't do that again," he said. This time, he did not lower his voice. This time, he did not soften the words. Daenerys did not flinch. "Watch me," she replied. The simplicity of it struck harder than any argument. Jon stepped forward, the distance between them narrowing, though it no longer carried the same meaning it once had. "This isn't the same," he said. "This isn't a response to defiance. This is control." He gestured toward the lords, toward the room, toward everything that had been building since the execution. "You're trying to force loyalty. I am ensuring it," she corrected. Their gazes locked. And this time, neither of them looked away. "You're making them fear you," Jon said. "They already do," she answered. "That's not the same as loyalty. It's enough." The words echoed in the same place they had before. Enough. Always enough. Jon felt something in him shift then, not slowly, not carefully, but all at once, the weight of everything that had led them here pressing down in a way that left no room for uncertainty anymore. "No," he said. The word cut through the room. Daenerys' expression did not change. But the air did. "No?" she repeated. Jon held her gaze, his voice steady now, stronger than it had been in days, not because he was certain of what would come next, but because he was certain of what he could not allow. "I won't stand with you on this," he said. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Because this was the moment they had been waiting for. Daenerys did not react immediately. She simply looked at him. Really looked. As though measuring something that could not be undone once it was decided. "And what will you do instead?" she asked. The question was not a challenge. It was a line. Jon felt it. He understood it. He knew what it meant. And for the first time since he had entered the room, he hesitated. Not because he did not know what was right, but because he knew what it would cost. His gaze shifted, just for a moment, not away from her, but across the room, to the lords who watched in silence, to the people who would follow whatever decision was made here, to the realm that rested on the edge of something it might not survive. Then back to her. And in that moment, something changed. Not in her. In him. Because she saw it. The hesitation. The uncertainty. The space between belief and action. And that was enough. It was all she needed. "I see," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than anything else she had said. "You don't know what to choose." Jon did not answer. Because he did. He just hadn't said it yet. And that was the difference. That was the line. That was the moment. Daenerys turned away from him, not abruptly, not angrily, but with a calm finality that felt far more decisive than any outburst could have been. She addressed the room instead, her voice returning to the same steady authority that had held the realm in place since she had taken the throne. "We move forward," she said. And just like that, the decision was made. Not because Jon had agreed, but because he had not stopped her. And in that silence, in that hesitation, in that single moment where he had failed to stand fully against her, something between them shifted beyond repair. He had made his choice. Even if he had not spoken it. The Red Keep did not feel like a seat of power anymore. It felt like a fortress. Not because its walls had grown stronger, but because everything within them had grown colder. Daenerys Targaryen moved through its halls with the same control she had always carried, her presence steady, her decisions sharp, but something had changed in the way the space responded to her. Conversations ended before she entered. Eyes lowered more quickly. Even the air seemed to hold itself tighter when she passed, as though the castle itself understood that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The court still obeyed her. The realm still bent to her will. But the distance between her and everything else had widened, not in defiance, but in silence. Jon saw it in the way the council no longer spoke freely. Where once there had been cautious debate, there was now agreement offered too quickly, decisions accepted without question, not because they were right, but because no one wished to challenge them. Jon Snow stood among them, his presence unchanged in form, but altered in meaning, his voice no longer the balance it had once been, but something watched, measured, weighed against the Queen's growing certainty. He had not spoken again in opposition since the council, not because he had changed his mind, but because he understood now what his hesitation had done. It had not stopped her. It had only confirmed that he would not stand fully against her. And in that confirmation, she had moved forward without him. The decisions came faster after that. Orders carried through the city with efficiency that bordered on precision, the remaining hesitant houses brought into alignment not through open destruction, but through calculated pressure, displays of force that reminded without needing to repeat what had already been done. It worked. The realm settled. Resistance did not rise. But neither did trust. What replaced it was something quieter, something more controlled, something that held the kingdom together not by unity, but by inevitability. And at the center of it all, Daenerys stood alone, not because she had been abandoned, but because she had chosen to stand where no one else could reach her. Jon found her in the throne room less often now, not because she avoided it, but because she no longer needed it in the same way. Power followed her without the throne. It settled around her in every space she entered, shaping itself to her presence without effort. When he did see her there, it was not as it had been before, not with the subtle alignment that had once existed between them, but with a distance that felt deliberate, as though something had been placed between them and neither of them had chosen to remove it. He stood beside her still, but it no longer felt like standing together. It felt like standing near. Late one evening, when the court had finally dispersed and the castle had fallen into its uneasy quiet, Jon sought her out, not because the realm required it, not because a decision demanded discussion, but because something in him refused to let the distance remain without challenge. He found her in the solar, the windows open to the night, the city beyond lit in scattered points that no longer felt like hope so much as endurance. She stood at the center of the room, a map spread before her, her attention fixed, her posture still, as though she had been there for hours and had not moved at all. "You don't rest," he said as he entered, the words softer than they had been in days, though no less deliberate. She did not look up immediately. "There is too much to do," she replied, her voice steady, unchanged. Jon stepped closer, his gaze shifting to the map, to the markers placed with careful precision across the realm, each one representing something secured, something controlled. "There will always be too much," he said. "That doesn't mean you have to carry it alone." The words hung between them, familiar in shape, but different in meaning now, heavier, more uncertain. Daenerys' hand stilled over the map, though she did not lift her gaze. "I don't," she said. "The realm carries it." Jon let out a quiet breath, something in him tightening at the distance in the answer. "That's not what I meant." This time, she looked at him. And for a moment, the space between them shifted, not fully, not enough to close what had opened, but enough to reveal something beneath the surface, something that had not entirely disappeared. "I know what you meant," she said. "But it's not how this works anymore." There was no anger in her voice, no accusation, only certainty, and that certainty struck deeper than anything else she could have said. Jon held her gaze, searching for something he could still reach. "It doesn't have to be like this," he said. "We can still." He stopped himself before finishing, because the words no longer felt complete, because whatever they had once been building no longer existed in the same form. "We can't," she said. The interruption was quiet, but final. Jon felt the weight of it settle into him, the realization that this was not something that had happened suddenly, not something that could be undone by a single conversation or a single decision. It had been building, piece by piece, moment by moment, until it had become something else entirely. "You don't trust me anymore," he said, not as a challenge, but as a recognition. Daenerys' expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, something that might have been regret, but did not fully form. "I trust you to be who you are," she replied. "But that is not always what I need." The words lingered. Sharp. Clear. Unavoidable. Jon nodded slowly, though the motion carried more weight than agreement. "And what do you need?" he asked. Daenerys looked back to the map, her hand moving again, adjusting one of the markers with quiet precision. "Someone who won't hesitate," she said. The answer did not come with emotion. It did not need to. Jon stood there for a moment longer, the space between them filled with everything that had been said and everything that had not, and he understood then, more clearly than he had before, that the distance between them was no longer something growing. It had settled. It had taken shape. And it was not going away. He turned to leave, not because he had nothing left to say, but because the words he might have spoken no longer had a place to land, no longer had a space to exist between them. As he reached the door, he paused, just briefly, his voice quieter than it had been in any of their conversations before. "You're not alone," he said. Daenerys did not turn. "I am," she replied. And this time, there was no space left to argue it. Jon left the room without another word, the door closing softly behind him, the sound carrying through the quiet in a way that felt far louder than it should have. Behind him, Daenerys remained where she stood, the map before her, the realm beneath her control, the silence around her complete. She had everything she had come for. The throne. The power. The kingdom. And yet, as the night deepened and the castle settled into stillness, there was nothing in that silence that felt like victory. The decision did not come in anger. It came in clarity. By the time the court was called, by the time the banners were raised and the lords gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling of the throne room, Daenerys Targaryen had already chosen the path she would take, and nothing within those walls had the power to turn her from it. The realm had settled into obedience, but obedience was not enough. Not when it came from fear alone. Not when it could be broken the moment that fear weakened. What she intended now was not to hold the kingdom together, but to make it unbreakable. Jon Snow felt it the moment he entered the hall, the shift in the air, the weight of something final pressing down over the gathered court. The lords stood in careful formation, their expressions controlled, their voices silent, as though they understood that this was not a day for argument. Even the guards held themselves differently, their presence sharper, more deliberate. When Jon reached his place beside the throne, he did not look at her immediately. He did not need to. He could feel the certainty in her, the absence of hesitation, the quiet resolve that had replaced the tension of previous days. Whatever she was about to do, she would not be questioned. Not this time. Daenerys rose slowly, the movement drawing every eye in the room without effort, her presence commanding in a way that no crown could replicate. She did not begin with preamble, did not offer explanation or justification, because she no longer needed to. The realm has known too many divisions, she said, her voice steady, carrying easily through the chamber. Too many houses placing their loyalty above the good of the whole. Too many rulers who believed their power was separate from the people they were meant to serve. Her gaze moved across the gathered lords, not searching, not questioning, but measuring, reminding. That ends now. Jon's jaw tightened slightly, though he did not move, did not interrupt, not yet. He listened, because he needed to understand not just what she was saying, but what she had already decided. The great houses will remain, she continued, but their power will not stand above the crown. Their armies will no longer answer only to them. Their resources will no longer be held at their discretion. From this day forward, the strength of the realm will belong to the realm itself. The words landed with quiet force, their meaning settling slowly, deeply, into the room. This was not a decree of punishment. It was something far larger. It was a reshaping. Murmurs began then, low, controlled, but impossible to suppress entirely, the lords exchanging glances, their composure cracking just enough to reveal the fear beneath. This was not what they had expected. This was not how power worked. It was not how it had ever worked. Jon felt the shift immediately, the fragile balance that had held the realm together tightening to its limit. "You can't do this," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, steady but firm. The room stilled. Daenerys turned to him, her expression unchanged, though her eyes held something sharper now, something that had been waiting for this moment. "I can," she replied. Jon stepped forward, the distance between them closing in a way that carried none of the connection it once had. "You'll tear the realm apart," he said. "The houses won't accept this. You're taking everything from them." His voice did not rise, but the urgency in it was unmistakable, the weight of what he was saying pressing into every word. Daenerys held his gaze, unflinching. "I am taking from them what was never meant to belong to them alone," she said. "Power that divides weakens. Power that unites endures." "That's not unity," Jon said. "That's control." The word hung in the air, heavy, familiar, unavoidable. Daenerys did not react to it. She had heard it before. It no longer held the same weight. "It's survival," she replied. The exchange lasted only seconds, but the room felt it as something far greater, something that carried beyond the words themselves, something that confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. This was no longer a partnership. This was a line. Jon looked at her, searching for something, anything that might still reach her, might still pull her back from the path she had chosen, but all he found was certainty, absolute and unwavering. "This isn't what we agreed to build," he said quietly. For a moment, something flickered in her expression, something that might have been memory, might have been something else, but it did not hold. "This is what it became," she said. The finality of it settled into him like something immovable. Jon did not speak again. Because he understood now. Not just what she was doing. But why? And more importantly, what it meant for everything that remained between them. Daenerys turned back to the court, her voice rising just enough to reclaim the room completely. "The realm will adapt," she said. "It always does. And those who stand with it will have a place in what comes next. Those who do not." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The silence that followed carried the meaning more clearly than any words could have. Outside, the city continued its uneasy rebuilding, unaware of the shift that had just taken place within the walls of the Red Keep, unaware that the structure of power itself had begun to change in a way that would reach every corner of the realm. Inside, the lords stood in silence, their choices narrowing with each passing moment, their loyalty no longer a matter of tradition, but of necessity. Jon remained where he stood, the weight of everything pressing down on him with a clarity he could no longer ignore. This was not a moment that could be undone. This was not a decision that could be softened or reshaped. This was a line that had been crossed fully, completely, without hesitation. And whatever remained between them would not survive what came next. Night fell slowly over King's Landing, the last light fading from the sky as if the world itself were reluctant to let the day end, as though something in it understood that what had been set in motion could not be undone. The Red Keep stood silent above it all, its towers dark against the horizon, its halls quieter than they had ever been, not with peace, but with something closer to finality. Jon Snow did not wait for summons this time. He did not wait for the court to disperse or for the weight of the day's decree to settle into the realm. He went to her because there was nothing left to delay, nothing left to pretend could be held together through silence or time. If anything remained between him and Daenerys Targaryen, it would not survive another moment unspoken. He found her where he had begun to expect she would be when she allowed herself to stand still, in the solar overlooking the city, the windows open to the night air, the faint sound of the sea carried upward in quiet rhythm. She stood with her back to the room, her figure outlined against the dim glow beyond, unmoving, as though she had been there for some time, as though she had been waiting without admitting it even to herself. For a moment, he did not speak. He let the silence exist, not because he feared breaking it, but because he understood now that it was the last time it would exist in this way between them. "You've already decided," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. Daenerys did not turn immediately. She did not need to ask what he meant. "Yes," she replied. The answer came without hesitation. It always did now. Jon stepped further into the room, the distance between them narrowing with each step, though it no longer felt like something that could be closed. "And nothing I say will change that," he added. This time, she turned. Her gaze met his, steady, unwavering, but not without something beneath it, something that had not entirely disappeared despite everything that had come between them. "No," she said. There was no anger in it. No defensiveness. Only truth. Jon nodded once, absorbing it, not because it was new, but because hearing it spoken made it final in a way nothing else had. He moved closer, stopping only when the space between them felt as small as it could be without touching, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything pressing into that silence, every moment they had shared, every decision that had led them here, every possibility that had once existed now reduced to something far simpler, far more fragile. "We could have done this differently," he said. The words were not an accusation. They were something else. Something closer to regret. Daenerys' expression shifted slightly, something in her eyes softening in a way it had not in days, as though the memory of what they had been still existed somewhere beneath the certainty she had built around herself. "No," she replied quietly. "We couldn't have." Jon let out a slow breath, the weight of it settling into his chest. "We had a choice," he said. "We had time." He gestured slightly, not at the room, not at the throne, but at everything beyond them, at the path they had taken together. "We didn't have to become this." Daenerys stepped closer then, closing the distance between them in a way that felt both familiar and entirely different, her presence still carrying the same pull it always had, though now it was sharpened by everything that stood between them. "You still think this is about what we wanted," she said. "It isn't." Her voice was softer now, but no less certain, the conviction in it deeper, more ingrained than anything he could reach with words alone. "It's about what this world demands." Jon shook his head slightly, the motion small, but firm. "No," he said. "It's about what you're willing to become for it." The words lingered. Heavy. Unavoidable. For a moment, Something flickered across her face, something that might have been anger, might have been pain, but it did not take shape. It passed, as everything else had, replaced by the same unwavering certainty that had carried her through everything she had endured. "And what are you willing to become?" she asked. The question struck deeper than anything else she could have said. Jon did not answer immediately. He could not. Because the truth was not simple. Because the answer would not only define him. It would define them. "I won't become someone who destroys what we're trying to protect," he said at last. Daenerys held his gaze, her expression unreadable, though something in her eyes shifted again, something quieter, something more personal. "Then you will lose it," she replied. The certainty in her voice did not waver. It never did. Jon stepped even closer, the space between them now almost non-existent, the tension thick enough to feel, the pull between them stronger than it had any right to be given everything that had happened. "Maybe," he said. "But at least I'll still know what I'm fighting for." For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, everything else falling away, the throne, the war, the realm, all of it reduced to something distant compared to what stood between them now. Daenerys looked at him, really looked, as though trying to hold on to something that was slipping beyond her reach, something that had existed before any of this had begun, before power had reshaped everything around them. "We were stronger together," she said. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a truth. Jon felt it settle into him, the weight of it undeniable, the memory of what they had built still present, still real, even now. "We were," he said. The agreement did not bring them closer. It only made the distance clearer. "And we could still be," she added, her voice quieter now, though no less certain, the offer hanging between them, fragile in a way nothing else had been. Jon held her gaze, the pull of it undeniable, the part of him that still wanted to believe, still wanted to find a way back to what they had been, pressing against everything else that had changed. For a moment, it felt possible. For a moment, it felt close. Then he saw it. Not just what she was offering, but what it required. And that moment passed. "No," he said. The word was quiet. But it was enough. Daenerys did not react. Not visibly. But something in her expression closed, something that had remained open despite everything, something that had held onto the possibility that they might still find their way back to each other. "That's your choice," she said. Jon nodded once. "It is." The silence that followed was not uncertain. It was final. They stood there for a moment longer, the distance between them now absolute, not in space, but in everything that mattered, everything that had once connected them now replaced by something else entirely. Then Jon turned. And walked away. This time, he did not stop. The night did not end when Jon left her. It stretched on, heavy and unrelenting, as though the world itself refused to move forward until something within it had been decided. Jon Snow walked the halls of the Red Keep without direction, the echoes of his own footsteps following him like a reminder that there was no one left to walk beside. He had told himself that leaving that room would bring clarity, that distance would make the choice easier to hold, but it had done the opposite. It had made everything sharper. Every memory. Every word. Every moment where things could have gone differently but hadn't. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the narrow windows, he understood something he had been trying not to accept. The choice had already been made. Not in that room. Not in that moment. But slowly, piece by piece, with every decision that had led them here. The city below had begun to change again. The effects of Daenerys' decree were already taking hold, not in chaos, but in quiet submission. Houses sent envoys before they were summoned. Armies reorganized under the crown's command without resistance. What had once been fragile now hardened into something more rigid, more controlled. It was working. That was the truth Jon could not ignore. The realm was stabilizing. The divisions that had once threatened to fracture it were closing, not through unity, but through inevitability. And yet, as he stood above it all, watching the kingdom fall into line, he felt no sense of victory. Only the weight of what it had cost. And what it would continue to cost. By midday, the summons came again, though this time it was not for counsel, not for strategy, not for anything that could be debated or delayed. It was a call to witness. Jon entered the throne room to find it already filled. The lords gathered once more, their expressions carefully composed, though the tension beneath them was impossible to hide. At the center of it all stood Daenerys Targaryen, her presence commanding, her posture unwavering, as though everything that had led to this moment had only strengthened her resolve. When her gaze found his, it did not soften. It did not shift. It held, steady and certain, as though she already knew what he would do. The proceedings were brief. Another house had delayed compliance with her decree, not openly defying it, but not embracing it either, lingering in the space between obedience and resistance. It was enough. It was always enough now. The lord in question stood before her, his posture rigid, his expression controlled, but his eyes betrayed the truth he could not hide. He was afraid. Not of death. Of what her rule meant. Of what it would become. Jon watched it unfold with a stillness that felt unnatural, his instincts no longer pulling him forward, no longer urging him to intervene. He had done that before. He had spoken. He had argued. And it had changed nothing. "Do you accept the authority of the crown?" Daenerys asked, her voice carrying through the hall with quiet force. The lord hesitated. Only for a moment. But it was enough. Jon felt the shift before it happened, the tightening of the air, the subtle change in the room as everyone present understood what that hesitation meant, what it would bring. He could have spoken then. He could have stepped forward, could have offered the same argument, the same reasoning, the same plea for restraint that had once held weight between them. But he did not. Because this time, he knew. This time, he understood that the moment for words had already passed. "Yes," the Lord said finally, though the word came too late, its timing betraying the truth it was meant to hide. Daenerys studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering, her expression unchanged, and then she nodded once, the decision settling into place with quiet finality. "Then prove it," she said. The command was carried out without question. The Lord was taken, not burned, not publicly destroyed as before, but removed, his power stripped, his lands absorbed into the crown's control, his fate sealed without spectacle. It was cleaner. Quieter. More controlled. More absolute. The court watched, not in shock this time, but in understanding. This was how it would be now. This was what her rule meant. Jon stood where he was, the weight of it pressing into him, not because he had not expected it, but because he had. Because he had seen it coming and had chosen not to stand in its way. His gaze shifted to her, to the woman who had once stood beside him, who had once listened, who had once hesitated, and for a moment, he wondered if she saw it too. The choice he had made. The line he had crossed. When the court dismissed, the lords left quickly, their movements efficient, their voices low, the understanding of what had just taken place settling into them with quiet certainty. Jon did not move immediately. He remained where he was, the throne looming behind her, the space between them now defined not by distance, but by everything that had changed. Daenerys descended the steps slowly, her gaze finding his once more, and for a moment, the room felt as it had before, the two of them alone in a space that had once held something different. "You said no," she said. Jon did not look away. "I did." Her gaze held his, searching, measuring, though there was no uncertainty in it now, no expectation that he might say something different, that he might step back into the place he had once held. "And yet," she continued, her voice quiet, "you didn't stop me." The truth of it settled into him, heavy and undeniable. "No," he said. The word carried more weight than anything else he had spoken. Daenerys nodded once, the motion small, but significant, as though something had been confirmed, something that no longer needed to be questioned. "Then the choice is made," she said. Jon felt it then, fully, completely, the finality of it, the understanding that there was no space left between them for uncertainty, no ground left to stand on that belonged to both of them. He had chosen. Not by action, but by inaction. By silence. By allowing what he could not accept to continue without resistance. "I didn't choose this," he said, though even as he spoke, he knew how hollow it sounded. Daenerys held his gaze, her expression unchanged. "You did," she replied. The words were not harsh. They did not need to be. They were simply true. Jon did not answer. Because there was nothing left to say. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was empty. And in that emptiness, something settled into place, something that could not be undone, something that would shape everything that came next. The decision had been made. And now, there was only one path forward. The decision did not feel like one. It did not arrive in a moment of clarity or certainty, did not come with the kind of conviction Jon had once believed choices like this demanded. It settled into him slowly, heavily, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface long before he was ready to name it. Jon Snow did not seek counsel. There was no one left he could speak to without turning what remained into something political, something strategic, something that would strip it of the truth it still held. This was not about the throne. Not anymore. It was about what came after it. And whether there would be anything left worth protecting if he did nothing at all. The Red Keep stood quieter than ever that night, the corridors dim, the torches burning low, as though the castle itself understood what was coming and chose not to bear witness too closely. Jon moved through it without hesitation, his step steady, his path clear, not because the weight of what he was about to do had lessened, but because it had settled into something he could no longer ignore. Every moment had led here. Every decision. Every silence. Every line crossed and left unanswered. By the time he reached the Solar, he knew there was no other way this could end. Daenerys Targaryen was there, as she always was when the world allowed her stillness, standing at the window, the city beyond her cast in shadow and scattered light. She did not turn when he entered. She did not need to. "I wondered when you would come," she said, her voice calm, almost quiet, as though this moment had existed long before either of them had stepped into it. Jon closed the door behind him, the sound softer than it should have been, and for a moment, he simply stood there, looking at her, at the woman who had stood beside him, who had built something with him, who had become something else entirely. "It doesn't have to end like this," he said. The words felt familiar. They had always felt familiar. Daenerys turned slowly, her gaze meeting his, steady, unshaken, as though she had already heard everything he was going to say. "It already has," she replied. Jon stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing with each step, though it no longer carried the same meaning it once had. "You can still change this," he said. "You can stop. Pull back. Let the realm breathe." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. The weight of it carried enough. "We can fix this." For a moment, something in her expression shifted, something softer, something that might have been the echo of what they had once been, but it did not hold. It never held any more. "There is nothing to fix," she said. "The realm is stronger now than it has ever been." Her gaze did not waver. "Because it cannot break." Jon felt the words settle into him, cold, final. "Because it can't choose," he said. The silence that followed was brief, but it carried everything. Daenerys stepped closer, closing the distance between them completely now, her presence still carrying that same pull, that same undeniable force that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "You think this is wrong," she said. "But you see what I see. You know what this world is." Her voice softened slightly, though the certainty in it remained. You just refuse to accept what it requires. Jon held her gaze, the weight of everything pressing into him, every moment, every word, every choice that had led them here. No, he said quietly. I refuse to become it. The words did not anger her. They did not surprise her. They settled. Like something expected. Daenerys reached for him then, her hand resting lightly against his arm, the contact familiar, grounding, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with what still remained between them. You don't have to, she said softly. Not alone. Her eyes searched his, something deeper there now, something that had not been completely lost. Stay with me, she added. Stand with me. We can build something better than what came before. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The offer was real. The connection was real. Everything they had been was still there, just beneath the surface, waiting, fragile but not entirely gone. Jon felt it. He felt the pull of it, the possibility, the part of him that still wanted to believe that this could be enough, that she could still be reached, that they could still find a way back to something that did not end like this. Then he remembered the fire. The silence. The fear. The people who had not been part of any plan. And the moment passed. I can't, he said. The words were quieter than anything else he had spoken. But they carried more weight. Daenerys' hand stilled against his arm, her gaze holding his for a moment longer, something flickering there, something that might have been pain, might have been something else entirely, but it did not surface. It settled, transformed into something colder, something controlled, something that no longer reached for him in the same way. Then you've made your choice, she said. Jon nodded once. I have. The silence that followed was not uncertain. It was complete. He moved then, not quickly, not violently, but with a steadiness that felt more final than anything else, his hand finding the hilt of his blade, the motion deliberate, unhidden. Daenerys did not step back. She did not call for guards. She did not reach for power. She simply watched him, her expression calm, her gaze steady, as though she had already accepted what was about to happen, as though this moment had been inevitable from the beginning. You won't do it, she said. It was not a challenge. It was belief. Jon felt it, the weight of it, the truth of what they had been, of what she still saw in him, and for a moment, it almost stopped him. Almost. I have to, he said. The words barely left him before the moment broke. The blade moved. Not fast. Not slow. Just enough. Daenerys' breath caught, her eyes widening not in fear, but in something else, something that held onto him even as everything else fell away. For a brief, impossible moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, everything else disappearing, the throne, the realm, the war, all of it gone, leaving only what had once been and what had become. Jon caught her as she fell, lowering her carefully, his hand steady despite everything inside him breaking apart, his gaze fixed on hers as the light in them began to fade. I'm sorry, he said, though the words felt empty, though nothing could undo what had just been done. Daenerys looked at him, her expression softening, something in it returning, something that had been lost, something that had existed before power had taken everything else from them. You chose them, she said, her voice barely more than a breath. Jon shook his head, the motion breaking, uneven. I chose what was right. For a moment, it seemed as though she might argue, might push back, might hold on to the certainty she had carried through everything else. But she didn't. Instead, something in her gaze softened further, something quieter, something almost peaceful. Then I hope they were worth it, she said. The words settled into him. Deep. Unavoidable. And then the light in her eyes faded. Jon remained there, holding her, the silence around him absolute, the weight of everything pressing in on him at once, the reality of what he had done settling into him with a force that left no room for anything else. The betrayal had come. And there was no going back. The city did not erupt. It did not descend into chaos or fire or the kind of violence that marked the end of wars. Instead, it held its breath. The news moved through King's Landing the way all truths did when they were too large to grasp at once, quietly at first, carried in whispers that sounded like rumor, then with growing certainty as those whispers began to align. The Dragon Queen was dead. The words passed from mouth to mouth, from soldier to servant to lord, until they settled into something undeniable, something that no one could ignore, even if they did not yet know what it meant. Jon Snow did not leave the room where it had happened. Not immediately. He remained where he was, the weight of what he had done still unfolding inside him, still finding its shape, still refusing to settle into anything that resembled understanding. He had made the choice. He had acted. And yet, the silence that followed did not feel like resolution. It felt like the absence of something that had once filled the space around him entirely. They found him there. The Unsullied entered first, their formation unbroken, their discipline absolute, but even in their stillness, there was something different, something that had not been present before. They did not rush him. They did not draw their weapons immediately. They saw her. They understood. And for a moment, even they hesitated, the reality of it holding them in place. Then the world moved again. Jon did not resist when they took him. He did not speak. There was nothing left to say that would change what had already been done. As they led him through the halls of the Red Keep, the castle seemed to shift around him, the same stone walls now unfamiliar, the same corridors heavier, as though they carried the weight of what had happened within them. Outside, the reaction was quieter than anyone would have expected. There was no immediate uprising, no surge of vengeance that tore through the streets. There was only uncertainty. The armies held their positions. The lords gathered in private, their voices low, their expressions sharp with calculation and something closer to caution than outrage. The power that had once centered entirely on Daenerys Targaryen had not vanished. It had fractured. And no one was yet certain where it would settle. The council was called before night fell, not as it had been before, not as a place of strategy or decision, but as something more urgent, more fragile. The throne room filled once more, the lords returning with careful composure, their loyalty no longer directed, but searching. The Iron Throne stood empty, its presence looming over the room like a question that no one had yet answered. Jon was brought in under guard, his hands unbound, but his freedom clearly removed, and for the first time since he had taken the throne beside her, he stood alone before the court, not as king, not as ally, but as something else entirely. No one spoke at first. No one wanted to be the first. Finally, a voice broke the silence, cautious, controlled. What happens now? The question did not belong to any one lord. It belonged to all of them. It belonged to the realm itself. Jon did not answer immediately. He stood there, the weight of the moment pressing into him, the reality of what he had done now no longer contained to a single room, a single act, but spread across everything that came after. The realm goes on, he said at last. His voice was steady, though it carried something deeper now, something shaped by everything he had lost. It has to. The response did not satisfy. It could not. Because the realm had not simply lost a ruler. It had lost certainty. The discussions that followed were careful, measured, each lord stepping lightly, aware that any move could shift the fragile balance in ways they could not yet control. Some called for Jon's punishment, their voices controlled but firm, speaking of loyalty, of consequence, of the need to ensure that what had happened could not be repeated. Others were quieter, more cautious, recognizing what his action had prevented, even if they would not speak it aloud. The divide was not open. Not yet. But it was there. Jon listened. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. Because there was no defense that mattered. He had done what he believed was right. And that belief did not change what it had cost. As night fell once more, the decision was made. Not by decree. Not by force, but by necessity. Jon would not rule. He would not sit the throne. The realm would not pass from one uncertain hand to another. Instead, he would be removed from it entirely, sent back to the north, not as king, not as ruler, but as something simpler, something that carried no power beyond what he chose to carry himself. Exile. The word was not spoken with anger. It did not need to be. Jon accepted it without resistance. It was not punishment. Not in the way they meant it. It was consequence. And he had known, from the moment he made his choice, that it would come. When they led him from the hall, the throne remained empty behind him, the question of who would claim it still unanswered, the future of the realm uncertain in a way it had not been before. But for the first time since the war had ended, there was something else in that uncertainty. Possibility. The city would rebuild. The lords would adapt. The realm would find its shape again. But it would not be the same. Jon stepped out into the night air, the weight of the castle falling away behind him, the future before him unclear, undefined, but no longer tied to the throne he had once stood beside. He had made his choice. And the world had answered it. The world did not end with her. It changed. That was the truth Jon came to understand as the days passed, as the red keep faded into distance, as the road north stretched ahead of him in long, quiet miles that gave him nothing to do but think. Jon Snow did not look back when he left King's Landing. Not because he did not feel the pull of it, not because he did not carry what had happened within him, but because there was nothing behind him that could be undone by turning around. The throne remained. The realm endured. And the woman who had stood at the center of it all existed now only in memory, in consequence, in the shape of everything that had followed. The North welcomed him without celebration. There were no banners raised in triumph, no songs sung of return, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had left as something more and come back as something less. Or perhaps something simpler. The snow had begun to fall again by the time he reached Winterfell, the air sharp, familiar, untouched by the weight of southern politics and dragonfire. Here, the world moved differently. Slower. Cleaner. And yet, even here, her presence lingered in ways he had not expected, not in fear, not in command, but in memory. The stories had already begun. Of the Dragon Queen who had conquered the capital without burning it. Of the ruler who had reshaped the power of the realm. Of the woman who had been betrayed by the man who stood beside her. They did not speak her name with hatred. Not always. Some spoke it with caution. Some with respect. Some with something closer to regret. Jon heard it in passing, in quiet conversations, in the way people spoke of what had been and what might have been if things had ended differently. He did not correct them. He did not offer his version of the truth. Because there was no single truth left to tell. There was only what remained. In the south, the throne did not stay empty for long. The lords did what they had always done. They adapted. They negotiated. They reshaped the future in a way that allowed them to move forward without tearing the realm apart in the process. A new ruler was chosen, not by conquest, not by blood alone, but by agreement, fragile though it was. It was not perfect. It would never be perfect. But it held. For now. And that was enough. The world she had feared, the one that fractured and turned on itself the moment strength faltered, did not come to pass. Not immediately. Not in the way she had believed it would. The realm did not collapse without her control. It did not descend into chaos the moment fear was removed from its foundation. Instead, it did something quieter. Something slower. It continued. But it was not unchanged. The power of the great houses never returned to what it had been. The idea she had set into motion, that power should belong to the realm itself, lingered, reshaping decisions, influencing choices, leaving a mark that could not be erased even in her absence. The lords ruled differently now. More carefully. More aware of what could happen if they pushed too far, if they allowed vision to grow unchecked. Her rule had ended. But its impact had not. And neither had what she had been. Jon understood that more than anyone. He carried it with him in ways no one else could see, in the quiet moments, in the long nights where sleep came slowly and left too quickly, in the spaces where memory replaced presence. He remembered her as she had been before the throne, before the power, before the weight of everything had reshaped her into something neither of them had fully understood until it was too late. He remembered the way she had listened. The way she had trusted him. The way they had stood together, believing, even for a moment, that what they were building could be something different. And he remembered the fire. The certainty. The moment where everything had changed. He did not regret the choice he had made. But he understood it. He understood what it had taken. And what it had cost. Some nights, when the wind moved through the trees just right, when the world fell into that quiet stillness that existed only in the deepest hours before dawn, he could almost hear her voice again, not as it had been in the throne room, not as it had been in the final moments, but as it had been in the beginning, when the future had still felt open, when the path ahead had not yet narrowed into something inevitable. We were stronger together. The words lingered. They always would. Jon stood at the edge of the north, the land stretching before him, vast and untouched, a place where the weight of crowns and kingdoms held less power than the quiet truth of survival. He had been a king. He had been a ruler. He had stood beside the most powerful woman in the world and watched her become something no one else could have stopped. And in the end, he had been the one who did. Not because he wanted to, but because he believed he had to. The realm had survived. But not in the way either of them had imagined. And as the wind carried across the snow, as the world moved forward without them, one truth remained, quiet and unchanging beneath everything else. They had ruled together. And the world had not been strong enough to survive both their love and their power.